In September of 1971, a 30-year-old woman named Barbara Locchi and her companion, Antonio Lo Bianco, drove their car into the quiet, moonlit hills of the Italian countryside near Florence. They were exactly where they wanted to be, seeking a moment of peace and intimacy away from the prying eyes of their small village. But instead of returning home to their families the next morning, they would be found slumped in their seats, victims of a cold-blooded execution by a very specific .22 caliber Beretta. The mystery is not just the brutality of their end, but why a killer would target a couple in such a serene setting, and why this single act of violence would be the opening chapter of a 14-year reign of terror that the Italian police would never truly be able to stop. Tonight, I'm going to tell you 14 stories about people who encountered the strange, the dark, and the mysterious in ways they never could have prepared for. But before we get into our first case, if you could please do me a huge favor. If you enjoy these stories, please offer to take the like button for a quiet, romantic drive through the rolling hills of Tuscany. But the second it starts to lean back and enjoy the moonlight, I want you to suddenly pull over, jump out of the car, and sprint into the darkness as fast as you can. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from today. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. Now, let us get into our first story. The air in the Tuscan hills during the middle of September has a very specific weight to it. It is thick with the scent of damp earth and the heavy, sweet aroma of grapes that are just days away from being harvested. On this particular night, the wind was almost non-existent, leaving the rows of grapevines standing like silent, leafy sentinels under a pale moon. The only sound for miles was the rhythmic, high-pitched chirping of crickets, a noise so constant that it eventually became a form of silence. But if you were standing near the edge of the dirt track leading into the vineyard, you might have smelled something that didn't belong. It wasn't the earth or the vines. It was the sharp, acrid bite of spent gunpowder hanging in the stagnant air, mixing with the smell of old upholstery. Barbara Locchi was 30 years old, and in her small village near Florence, everyone knew her name. She was a woman who lived her life with a certain kind of intensity that the local gossips couldn't stop talking about. She was married to a man named Stefano Mele, but their relationship was complicated, filled with long absences and whispered rumors. Barbara was beautiful, with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets she wasn't ready to share with anyone. She spent her days navigating the rigid social expectations of rural Italy, but she always seemed to be looking for an exit, a way to breathe outside the confines of her marriage and the small-town judgment. She was a mother, a wife, and a woman who simply wanted to feel something other than the weight of her routine. Antonio Lo Bianco was the kind of man who didn't ask for much out of life. He was a laborer, a man with calloused hands and a straightforward way of looking at the world. To him, Barbara wasn't a subject of gossip. She was a woman who made the world feel a little less gray. He didn't care about the whispers in the town square or the complications of her domestic life. On that Tuesday night, all he wanted was to be with her, away from the eyes of the village and the pressure of their daily lives. He had borrowed a car, a modest little vehicle that felt like a sanctuary on wheels. As he drove through the winding roads, he wasn't thinking about danger or shadows. He was focused on the road ahead and the woman sitting in the passenger seat. The drive from the village to the outskirts of Sino was slow and deliberate. Antonio knew these roads by heart, every dip in the asphalt and every sharp curve where the stone walls hugged the edge of the path. He kept the speed low, the engine of the car making a steady, reassuring hum that filled the cabin. Barbara sat beside him, her silhouette illuminated occasionally by the faint glow of the dashboard lights. Neither of them spoke much. There was no need for it. The further they got from the lights of the houses, the more the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them and the narrow beam of the headlights cutting through the darkness. They passed through small groves of olive trees, their silvery leaves flashing like schools of fish in the light. When they finally reached the spot near the vineyard, Antonio slowed the car to a crawl. The tires crunched over the loose gravel and dry grass of a small turnout. He shifted the gear into neutral, and for a moment, the engine idled, sending a slight vibration through the floorboards. Then, he turned the key. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. It was the kind of silence that makes you notice the sound of your own breathing. Antonio pulled the handbrake, the ratcheting sound echoing sharply inside the car. He sat back, his muscles relaxing for the first time that day. Beside him, Barbara reached into her bag, the rustle of the fabric sounding much louder than it should have in the stillness of the night. Outside, the car's engine began to make those small, metallic ticking noises as the metal cooled down in the night air. It was a rhythmic, predictable sound. Tick, tick, tick. They rolled the windows down just a few inches to let in the cool breeze, which carried the scent of the nearby vines and the cooling earth. For the next hour, time seemed to lose its meaning. They weren't checking watches or thinking about the morning. They were anchored in the normalcy of a secret meeting, a ritual as old as the hills themselves. They felt safe in the enclosure of the car, believing the darkness around them was a cloak that hid them from the world. They were just two people in a car, in a quiet field, on a Tuesday night in September. Antonio happened to look toward the passenger side window, just past Barbara's shoulder. At first, he didn't see anything but the dark shapes of the grapevines, swaying gently in a breeze that he couldn't actually feel. But then, he noticed something that didn't fit the logic of the landscape. There was a shadow between two of the rows that was denser than the others. It was a vertical shape, about the height of a man, and it wasn't moving with the wind. It was perfectly still. Antonio didn't panic. He assumed it was a fence post, or perhaps a stray animal. But as he stared at it, the shape shifted. It didn't move like an animal. It leaned forward, and for a split second, a sliver of moonlight caught something metallic and cold near the top of that shadow. The logic in Antonio's brain started to misfire. He knew there shouldn't be anyone out here at this hour. This was private land, miles from the nearest house. He thought about reaching for the key in the ignition, but his hand felt heavy, as if he were moving through water. He didn't want to alarm Barbara, so he kept his voice low, his heart starting to thud against his ribs with a slow, heavy pressure. He told himself it was nothing, just a trick of the light and the exhaustion of the day. But that shadow was getting closer now. It was moving with a terrifying fluidity, silent as a ghost, closing the distance between the vines and the car door. The crickets, which had been chirping incessantly, suddenly went dead silent in that small patch of the vineyard. Your heart isn't just beating fast now, it is slamming against your chest wall like it is trying to break your ribs. Your palms are suddenly slick with sweat, making it hard to grip anything. You want to scream, but your throat feels like it has been filled with dry sand. You are trapped in a small metal box, and the darkness outside, which felt like a friend just minutes ago, has turned into a predator. You can hear the blood rushing in your ears, a deafening roar that drowns out everything else. Then, you hear it, a faint, metallic click from just outside the glass. It is a sound you recognize from your own life, the sound of a safety being switched off. Your muscles go completely rigid, a primal paralysis taking over your entire body. The first shot doesn't sound like a gun. In the confined space of the car, it sounds like a sledgehammer hitting a block of concrete. The glass of the side window doesn't just break, it disintegrates, spraying tiny, diamond-like shards across the seats. The smell of cordite hits you instantly, sharp and burning, stinging your nostrils and the back of your throat. You can't see anything through the smoke and the sudden blur of your vision. There is a high-pitched ringing in your ears that won't stop. You try to move, to duck, to find some cover, but there is nowhere to go. Another flash of light, and then another. The interior of the car is illuminated in strobe-like bursts, revealing the terrifying silhouette of a person standing just inches away, arm extended, perfectly calm. You are sitting in that car. The glass is gone. The person you were just talking to is no longer responding. You are staring into the black void of the open window. Do you try to scramble over the seats to the other door, knowing you are a perfect target in the moonlight? Or do you slump down and play dead, praying that the killer doesn't decide to open the door and finish the job? Because here is the thing. Antonio and Barbara didn't have a choice. The person outside wasn't looking for a conversation or a robbery. They were there for a very specific, very dark purpose. They were there to execute a ritual that they had practiced before, and they were doing it with the cold, mechanical precision of a professional who has lost all sense of human empathy. When the Italian police arrived at the scene the next morning, they found a nightmare. Barbara and Antonio were dead, but the crime scene was unlike anything they had seen in years. The killer hadn't taken any valuables. The car was still there, the keys were in the ignition, and the surrounding area was undisturbed. But when the ballistics report came back, the lead investigator felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The bullets pulled from the bodies were .22 caliber, Winchester brand with a series of distinct markings. They were fired from a Beretta, and these were not just any bullets. They matched a double homicide from 1968, 3 years earlier, a case that everyone thought was an isolated domestic tragedy. This meant that the man they had arrested for the 1968 murders, Barbara's husband Stefano Mele, might have been innocent, or at least he hadn't acted alone. The gun was still out there. The phantom who had disappeared after that first strike had returned to the hills of Florence. The police began to follow what they called the Sardinian Trail, looking into Barbara's past and the men she had known. They arrested suspects, they conducted hundreds of hours of interrogations, and they chased rumors of occult cults and secret societies. But every lead turned into a dead end. The Beretta .22 became a symbol of a ghost, a killer who would eventually be known as the Monster of Florence, a shadow that would haunt Tuscany for over a decade. Barbara and Antonio were the first victims of this new cycle, their lives ending in a spray of glass and lead in a beautiful vineyard. Stefano Mele would spend years in prison, but the killings would continue while he was behind bars, proving that the true monster was still walking the moonlit paths of the countryside. The mystery of who held that Beretta remains one of the most fiercely debated cold cases in Italian history. But while the investigators in Florence were struggling to find a ghost in the vines, thousands of miles away in the bustling heart of New York City, a different kind of violence was about to erupt in broad daylight. A powerful man was about to realize that even in the middle of a cheering crowd, you are never truly out of reach. In June of 1971, a powerful man named Joe Colombo stood in the heart of Columbus Circle in New York City, surrounded by thousands of cheering supporters. He was exactly where he wanted to be, celebrating Italian-American pride as a man who felt completely untouchable. But instead of finishing his speech, Joe would be approached by a man dressed as a humble cameraman who would suddenly pull a pistol and fire 3 rounds into Joe's head at point-blank range. The mystery is not just how a hitman got so close, but why a man like Jerome Johnson would take on a suicidal mission in front of a dozen bodyguards, and who was really pulling the strings from the shadows of the mafia underworld. The air in Manhattan on that late June morning was a thick, suffocating blanket of humidity that seemed to trap every sound and smell against the pavement. If you were standing in the middle of Columbus Circle, the first thing you would notice wasn't the music or the speeches, but the sheer, overwhelming roar of 50,000 people packed into the concrete plaza. It was a cacophony of shouting, cheering, and the rhythmic chanting of slogans that vibrated through the soles of your shoes. Underneath the noise, there was the heavy, greasy scent of street food vendors, cooking onions and peppers, mixing with the sharp, blue-gray haze of thousands of cigars being lit at the same time. Joe Colombo was 57 years old, and he was a man who lived 2 very different lives. To the FBI and the Department of Justice, he was the ruthless boss of the Colombo crime family, one of the 5 pillars of the American mafia. But to the thousands of people gathered in the streets that day, he was something else entirely. He was the founder of the Italian-American Civil Rights League. He was a man who walked with his head held high, wearing tailored suits that fit him like armor, and he had a way of looking people in the eye that made them feel like they were the only person in the world. He was a father and a leader who believed he had finally become too public to be hit. Joe's morning had started like any other day of a major event. He woke up early in his Brooklyn home, the house quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. He spent a long time picking out his clothes, settling on a sharp, light-colored suit that would stand out under the bright New York sun. He checked his reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting his tie with a slow, practiced movement. He wasn't a man who rushed. He took a final sip of his espresso, the bitterness lingering on his tongue, and then stepped out into the morning air. He felt a sense of profound purpose. Today was Unity Day, and he was the star of the show. He was convinced that he was changing history. When Joe arrived at Columbus Circle, the logistics of the event were already in full swing. He spent the first hour walking behind the main stage, shaking hands with the organizers and checking the placement of the microphones. He watched as workers struggled with the heavy blue and gold banners, the fabric snapping in the occasional gust of wind. He ran his hand over the edge of the wooden podium, feeling the rough grain of the wood under his fingertips. He greeted the police officers on duty with a nod, a subtle reminder that today they were on the same side. He moved through the crowd with a practiced ease, stopping to pat children on the head and kiss the cheeks of grandmothers. For the next several hours, the event followed a script that Joe had memorized weeks ago. He stood on the side of the stage, watching the various speakers take their turn at the microphone. He listened to the feedback of the speakers, that high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge, and watched the way the sun reflected off the thousands of tiny Italian flags being waved in the crowd. He checked his watch every 15 minutes, noting the slow progression of the afternoon. He took small sips from a paper cup of lukewarm water, the wax of the cup softening in the heat. He was surrounded by his most trusted bodyguards, men who stood like statues with their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The mundane nature of the rally was supposed to be Joe's greatest protection. There were news crews everywhere, their heavy cameras mounted on tripods, capturing every moment for the evening news. Joe was used to the cameras. He liked them. He would often stop to joke with the technicians, asking them about their equipment or the lighting. He felt that as long as the world was watching, his enemies and the other families wouldn't dare move against him. It was a peaceful, celebratory atmosphere. The sound of a high school marching band in the distance provided a rhythmic backdrop to the constant chatter of the supporters. Everything was going exactly according to the plan. A few yards away from the main stage, a man named Jerome Johnson was standing near the edge of the press area. He was wearing a press badge and carrying a professional-grade camera, looking for all the world like just another member of the media. But if you were looking closely, you might have noticed that Jerome wasn't actually looking through the viewfinder. He was standing with his feet planted slightly wider than a normal photographer would, and his hands were tucked strangely close to his chest. He wasn't adjusting the focus or checking his light meter. He was staring at the back of Joe Colombo's head with a flat, empty expression that didn't match the excitement of the crowd. Jerome took a slow step forward, moving into the gap between two of the security barriers. He didn't rush. He moved with a calm, almost robotic deliberateness. He brushed past a young woman holding a sign, and for a second, his camera bag bumped against her arm. He didn't apologize or even look at her. He just kept his eyes locked on Joe. He was now less than 10 feet away. He could see the individual strands of hair on the back of Joe's neck and the way the light caught the gold ring on Joe's finger as he reached for a set of notes. The air around Jerome felt strangely cold despite the heat, a pocket of silence in the middle of a screaming 50,000-person riot. You are standing on that stage, just a few feet behind the most powerful man in Brooklyn. The sun is beating down on your shoulders, and you can feel the sweat trickling down your spine. The roar of the crowd is so loud that it feels like a physical weight against your chest. You look to your left and see a cameraman who seems to be struggling with his equipment. He is fumbling with a lens, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. You think about asking him if he needs help, but then you see his eyes. They aren't the eyes of a journalist. They are wide and glassy, and they are fixed on the man in the light suit with a terrifying, singular intensity. You open your mouth to say something. The sound of the first shot doesn't even register as gunfire because the crowd is so loud. It sounds like a balloon popping or a firecracker going off in a trash can. But then you see the back of Joe's suit jacket erupt in a spray of white fabric and red mist. Joe doesn't fall immediately. He just stiffens, his arms jerking upward as if he's trying to catch something in the air. Then the second and third shots follow in rapid succession. Crack, crack. The world suddenly slows down. You can see the individual shell's casing bouncing on the wooden floor of the stage, glinting in the sun like gold coins. The smell of burnt powder fills the air, cutting through the scent of the street food. Joe collapses forward, his head hitting the podium with a dull, hollow thud. The microphones pick up the sound, amplifying it so it echoes across the entire plaza. For a heartbeat, there is a total, horrifying silence as 50,000 people try to process what they just saw. Then, the screaming starts. It is a raw, primal sound that starts near the stage and ripples outward like a shockwave. People start running in every direction, knocking over chairs and trampling banners. The bodyguards, who had been frozen for a split second, suddenly spring into action. They draw their weapons, their faces contorted in a mix of rage and panic as they look for the source of the hidden threat. You are Joe Colombo's lead bodyguard. You have spent your whole life protecting this man. You see the cameraman standing there, the pistol still in his hand, his face completely blank. Do you dive on top of your boss to shield him from more bullets, or do you draw your own gun and take down the threat before he can fire again? Because here is the thing. The choice was made in a fraction of a second. Jerome Johnson didn't even try to run. He just stood there, holding the gun, as if he were waiting for something. Before he could even blink, the other men on the stage opened fire. Jerome was hit multiple times, his body jerking under the impact before he fell to the ground, dead before he hit the concrete. The investigation that followed was a chaotic mess of conspiracy theories and dead ends. The police identified the shooter as Jerome Johnson, a 24-year-old black man with no clear ties to the mafia. This was unheard of. The mob didn't hire outsiders for hits on bosses, and they certainly didn't hire someone who would do it in broad daylight at a massive public event. The initial theory was that Jerome was a lone nut, but the people in the underworld knew better. They knew that someone had to have given Jerome that press pass and that gun. Someone had to have told him exactly where to stand. The mystery wasn't who pulled the trigger, but who had the audacity to order a hit on a public stage. The finger of suspicion eventually pointed toward Crazy Joe Gallo, a renegade mobster who had been at war with the Colombo family leadership for years. Gallo was known for his eccentric behavior and his willingness to break the old rules of the mafia. He had spent time in prison befriending black inmates, and the theory was that he had recruited Jerome Johnson as part of a new kind of hit squad that the traditional bosses wouldn't see coming. It was a move designed to embarrass and decapitate the Colombo family in the most public way possible. Gallo never admitted to it, but he was seen celebrating in the days after the shooting, a move that would eventually lead to his own violent end. Joe Colombo didn't die that day in Columbus Circle. He was rushed to the hospital, where surgeons worked for hours to remove the bullets from his brain. He survived the surgery, but the damage was too great. The man who had once commanded an army of thousands and led a massive civil rights movement was gone. He spent the next 7 years in a vegetative state, unable to speak or move, a ghost of the man he once was. He eventually passed away in 1978, but the Colombo family was never the same. The shooting marked the beginning of a bloody internal war that would redefine the New York underworld and prove that no one, no matter how public, was truly safe. The assassination of Joe Colombo was a turning point in the history of organized crime in America. It showed that the old rules of the Commission were being replaced by a more chaotic, unpredictable form of violence. But while the bullets were flying in New York, across the Atlantic in Italy, a different kind of criminal web was being spun. This one didn't involve street rallies or gunmen in the crowd. It involved high finance, the Catholic Church, and the laundering of millions of dollars in heroin money. The paper trail of a banker in Milan was about to lead to a series of deaths that would make the street wars of New York look simple by comparison. In 1971, a brilliant financier named Michel Sindona sat in his opulent office in Milan, overseeing a multi-billion-dollar empire. He was the most trusted advisor to the Vatican Bank, a man who moved money for the highest powers in the world. But instead of continuing his ascent to the pinnacle of global finance, Sindona's empire would begin to crumble as a simple investigation into heroin money revealed a rot that went all the way to the heart of the church. The mystery is not just the missing millions, but how a man of God's money could be so deeply entwined with the mafia, and why those who tried to look too closely kept ending up dead. The air in a high-end office in Milan during the early 1970s didn't smell like a city. It smelled like wealth. There was the heavy, buttery scent of expensive Italian leather from the armchairs and the sharp, slightly metallic smell of a silver inkwell sitting on a mahogany desk. In the absolute silence of the room, the only sound was the rhythmic, hollow ticking of a gold-encased grandfather clock. It was a sound that didn't just mark the time. It seemed to measure the weight of the secrets held within those four walls. Underneath the ticking, there was the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the city traffic far below, a reminder that while the world outside was moving in chaos, inside this room, everything was perfectly controlled. Michel Sindona was 51 years old in 1971, and he was arguably the most influential financial mind in all of Europe. He was a man who had risen from humble beginnings in Sicily to become the personal financial advisor to Pope Paul VI. People called him the Pope's banker, a title that carried more power than almost any political office. He was a small man, with a sharp, bird-like intensity and eyes that never seemed to blink when he was discussing multi-million-dollar transactions. He wore suits that were hand-tailored in London and carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that a single phone call from him could stabilize or destroy a national economy. Sindona's life was built on a foundation of absolute order and discretion. He was a man of habit. He lived in a world of private jets, five-star hotels, and hushed conversations in the corners of cathedrals. To the public, he was a pillar of the Catholic Church and a genius of international trade. He was a philanthropist who donated massive sums to religious charities and a family man who prided himself on his reputation. But behind that polished exterior, Michel Sindona was an architect of shadows. He was a man who understood that money didn't just have value. It had a history, and some histories needed to be erased. He was the bridge between the legitimate world of the Vatican and the dark underbelly of the Sicilian mafia. The daily routine for Michel Sindona at the height of his power was a masterclass in calculated repetition. Every morning, at precisely 7:30, he would sit down at his desk and begin the process of reviewing the overnight ledgers from his global network of banks. He would use a silver letter opener to slit the envelopes, the sound of the paper tearing being the first official act of his day. He would spread the documents out across the dark wood, his fingers tracing the columns of numbers with a speed that suggested he was reading a story rather than a balance sheet. He would mark certain figures with a small, precise check mark using a fountain pen that had been a gift from a high-ranking cardinal. After the initial review, there was the ritual of the espresso. A secretary would bring in a small porcelain cup on a silver tray. Sindona would take exactly 2 sips, the steam from the dark liquid rising to meet his face for just a moment before he set the cup back down. He never finished the coffee. It was just a pause, a moment to reset his mind before the phone calls began. The phones in his office didn't ring. They made a soft, melodic chirping sound. He would answer each one with a quiet, polite greeting, his voice never rising in volume regardless of the stakes. He would negotiate mergers, authorize transfers, and give advice to bishops with the same calm, detached tone. For hours on end, Sindona would move between these tasks. He would sign his name on hundreds of documents, the scratch of the nib against the parchment being a constant backdrop to the afternoon. He would adjust the cuffs of his shirt, making sure exactly half an inch of white linen showed beneath his jacket. He would walk to the window and look out over the rooftops of Milan, his hands clasped behind his back, reflecting on the sheer scale of the machine he had built. It was a machine made of paper and trust, and as long as the paper was filed correctly and the trust was maintained, he was the master of all he surveyed. He felt completely safe in the mundane nature of his work. The afternoon would transition into the evening with a series of meetings. These weren't held in boardrooms, but in the private dining rooms of exclusive clubs. Sindona would listen more than he spoke, his mind constantly calculating the hidden connections between the men sitting across from him. He would watch the way they handled their cutlery and the way they glanced at their watches. He was a student of human weakness, and he used that knowledge to ensure that every deal he made was tilted in his favor. He would return to his office late at night to perform one final check of the vaults, the sound of the heavy steel doors clicking into place being the final reassuring note of his day. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come in the form of a police raid or a screaming headline. It came as a single, typed name on an internal audit request for the Banco Privata Finanziaria. The name was Giorgio Ambrosoli. Ambrosoli was a lawyer, a man known for his stubborn integrity and his refusal to be intimidated. The request itself was routine, just a standard inquiry into the source of a series of large deposits from an offshore account. But Sindona noticed a small detail that most people would have missed. The account number mentioned in the request was one he had personally designated for special projects involving the heroin trade in the United States. It was a tiny crack in a massive dam, a detail that was logically out of place in a bank that was supposed to be the gold standard of religious finance. Sindona stared at that name for a long time, the paper feeling strangely heavy in his hand. He didn't panic, but he felt a slight, cold pressure at the base of his skull. He knew that if Ambrosoli started pulling on that thread, the entire tapestry of his life would begin to unravel. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere of his office, as if the oxygen had suddenly become a little thinner. For the first time in 20 years, Michel Sindona realized that he might have left a footprint in the mud that he couldn't simply wash away. Your heart isn't just beating fast now. It is slamming against your ribs like a trapped bird. You are sitting in your office, surrounded by the finest things money can buy, but suddenly the walls feel like they are closing in. You look at the phone, the same phone you have used to command empires, and you realize it is now a liability. Every word you say could be a confession. You feel a drop of cold sweat trickling down your spine, and your hands, which are usually so steady, are starting to tremble just enough to make the fountain pen rattle against the inkwell. You are the Pope's banker, but in this moment, you feel like a small boy lost in a storm. The silence of the room is no longer peaceful. You look out the window at the lights of Milan, and you realize that your shadow is longer than you thought. You are connected to men who don't care about balance sheets or religious charities. You are connected to men who solve problems with a bullet and a shallow grave. The weight of that realization is physical, pressing down on your shoulders until it is hard to draw a full breath. You think about the P2 Masonic Lodge and the promises they made to protect you, but you know that in the world of high-stakes corruption, loyalty is just a line item that can be deleted. You are standing on a glass floor, and you can see the jagged rocks waiting for you 1,000 feet below. You are Michel Sindona. You have millions of dollars in untraceable accounts and the ear of the most powerful religious leader on earth. But you also have a lawyer who won't stop asking questions. Do you try to buy him off, knowing that a man of his character might use the bribe as even more evidence against you? Or do you make the call that you can never take back, the call to the men in Sicily who don't take no for an answer? Because here is the thing. Once you cross that line, there is no going back to the world of espresso and tailored suits. You are either a banker or a monster, and in this moment, the choice feels like it has already been made for you by the very system you helped create. The fall of Michel Sindona was as spectacular as his rise. The investigation into the Banco Privata revealed a shadow network of political assassinations, money laundering, and a secret society called the Propaganda Due, or P2. This lodge was a who's who of Italian intelligence, politics, and the mafia, all working together to control the state. Giorgio Ambrosoli, the man who dared to look at the ledgers, was murdered outside his home by a hitman hired by Sindona. But the truth couldn't be buried forever. The collapse of Sindona's financial empire led to a chain reaction that took down banks in New York and Milan, exposing the deep, dark ties between the criminal underworld and the Catholic Church. The most bizarre part of the reveal came years later. In 1986, while serving a life sentence for the murder of Ambrosoli, Michel Sindona sat in his prison cell and was served a cup of coffee. It was a ritual he had performed every day of his life. But this cup was different. It contained a lethal dose of cyanide. The man who had managed the money of the Vatican and the mafia died in a fit of convulsions on his cell floor. To this day, no one knows for sure if he committed suicide, or if his former friends in the shadows decided that the Pope's banker knew too many secrets to be left alive. His death remains a haunting symbol of a web of corruption that was never truly untangled. The story of Michel Sindona is a reminder that when money, religion, and power become inextricably linked, the results are almost always fatal. His legacy is one of poisoned coffee, empty vaults, and a series of suicides that looked an awful lot like murders. But while the financial world of Italy was being shaken to its core by the discovery of state-sponsored corruption, on the other side of the globe, a different kind of government-backed nightmare was unfolding. In the streets of Mexico City, the targets weren't bankers or lawyers, but students. And the weapons weren't poisoned coffee or financial audits, but bamboo canes and high-powered rifles wielded by a secret army of shadows. In June of 1971, a young student in Mexico City joined a peaceful march for university autonomy, carrying nothing but a sign and a hope for change. He was exactly where he should have been, surrounded by thousands of peers in the bright afternoon sun. But instead of a peaceful protest, he would find himself hunted by a paramilitary group known as the Falcons, who were armed with bamboo sticks and high-powered rifles. The mystery is not just the suddenness of the massacre, but why the government would train secret assassins to execute wounded students in their own hospital beds, and how such a massive crime was kept silent for decades. The sound of 10,000 students chanting for freedom is not just a noise. It is a vibration that you feel in the soles of your shoes and deep in the center of your chest. On that Thursday in June, the air in Mexico City was thick with that vibration, mixed with the smell of roasting corn from street vendors and the metallic tang of exhaust from the old buses lining the avenues. It was a beautiful, clear day, and the sun was hot enough to make the asphalt feel soft underfoot. But then, a new sound cut through the rhythmic shouting. It was the sharp, dry crack of bamboo striking bone, followed by the terrifyingly familiar pop of a small-caliber pistol being fired into the air. Carlos was 20 years old and a third-year engineering student at the National Polytechnic Institute. He was the kind of young man who believed that the world could be fixed with logic and hard work. He spent his nights hunched over drafting tables, his fingers stained with graphite, obsessing over the tiny details of structural integrity. He had a girlfriend named Maria who studied literature, and they spent their weekends in crowded coffee shops, arguing about poetry and politics until the sun went down. Carlos wasn't a revolutionary. He was a son of the middle class who wanted a better university system and a future where he could build bridges that wouldn't collapse under the weight of corruption. His life was a series of predictable, comforting rituals. Every morning, he would wake up to the sound of his mother's radio, playing soft ballads in the kitchen. He would drink a cup of strong, black coffee while reading the sports page, then pack his bag with heavy textbooks and a neatly folded ham sandwich. He took the same bus at 7:15 every morning, sitting in the third row and watching the city wake up through the scratched window. He knew the names of the street vendors near his campus and the exact way the light hit the stone stairs of the library in the afternoon. To Carlos, 1971 felt like a year of infinite possibility, a time when his life was finally starting to take a real, solid shape. The march on June 10th, which happened to be the day of the Corpus Christi festival, started with a sense of nervous excitement. Carlos had met Maria near the train station, and they joined the stream of students flowing toward the main avenue. At first, the walk was almost festive. People were laughing, sharing water bottles, and holding up hand-painted signs that were still damp with ink. Carlos found himself walking near a group of older students who were leading the chants. He focused on the movement of his own feet, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of thousands of pairs of shoes hitting the pavement in unison. It was a repetitive, hypnotic sound that made him feel like he was part of something much larger than himself. As the hours passed, the heat of the afternoon intensified. Carlos could feel the sweat trickling down his neck, and the sign he was carrying began to feel heavy and awkward in his hands. He shifted it from his right shoulder to his left, trying to find a comfortable rhythm. Every few blocks, the march would slow down as they navigated around parked cars or groups of curious onlookers. Carlos watched the way the sunlight glinted off the windows of the tall buildings, and he listened to the low hum of conversation that filled the gaps between the slogans. It was a mundane stretch of time, filled with the simple physical exertion of walking under a hot sun, surrounded by the familiar faces of his peers and teachers. The marchers turned onto the Avenida de los Maestros, and for a moment the road seemed strangely wide and empty ahead of them. Carlos noticed a line of gray police vans parked a few hundred yards away, but he didn't think much of it. The police were a constant presence at these events. He kept walking, his mind wandering to the dinner he was supposed to have with Maria's family that evening. He wondered if he should buy a bouquet of flowers, or if that would be too formal. He adjusted his glasses, which were sliding down his nose, and took a deep breath of the dusty city air. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. He had no reason to believe that the next 5 minutes would change his life forever. Then, Carlos saw the first sign that something was logically out of place. A group of men, maybe 100 of them, were standing on the sidewalk near a row of trees. They weren't wearing police uniforms, and they weren't dressed like students. They wore civilian clothes, slacks, and button-down shirts, but they all had the same short, military-style haircuts. And they were all holding long, thick poles made of bamboo. It didn't make sense. Why would a group of civilians be standing there with weapons while the police watched from their vans? Carlos felt a slight prickle of unease on the back of his neck. He looked at Maria, but she was busy talking to a friend, her face bright with a smile that hadn't yet realized the danger. The men with the bamboo poles didn't wait for a signal. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized fluidity, vaulting over the low stone walls and charging directly into the front of the student line. The air was suddenly filled with the sound of wood smashing against flesh and the screams of people who had no idea they were being attacked. Carlos saw a student he recognized from his physics class go down under a flurry of blows, his sign splintering into a dozen pieces. The men, who would later be identified as Los Halcones or the Falcons, weren't just trying to disperse the crowd. They were attacking with a cold, calculated ferocity, targeting the head and the ribs with professional precision. Your heart isn't just beating fast now. It is slamming against your ribs like a trapped animal trying to claw its way out. You reach for Maria's hand, but the crowd surges, and suddenly she is gone, swallowed by a sea of panicked students. You try to turn around, but the weight of the people behind you pushes you forward, directly into the path of the men with the poles. You can feel the heat from the bodies around you, and the stinging, chemical burn of tear gas in your eyes. Your vision is a blur of gray shirts and wooden sticks. You raise your arms to protect your face, and the first blow hits your forearm with a sickening crack. The pain is white-hot, radiating all the way up to your shoulder. You are on the ground now. The asphalt is burning your palms, and you can taste the copper tang of blood in your mouth. You look up and see a man standing over you, his face a mask of cold, professional indifference. He isn't shouting, he is just focused on his target. You try to scramble away, but your legs feel like they are made of lead. The world is a cacophony of sirens, gunshots, and the wet, heavy sound of impact. You feel a second blow to the back of your head, and the sun-drenched street suddenly turns into a void of perfect, absolute darkness. Your last thought isn't about politics or university rights. It is the simple, desperate hope that Maria managed to run fast enough. When Carlos woke up, the world was white and smelled of bleach. He was in a hospital ward, his head wrapped in heavy bandages and his arm in a cast. The room was crowded with other students, most of them moaning in pain or staring at the ceiling with hollow eyes. For a few minutes, he felt a sense of relief. He had survived. He was in a place of healing. But then, he heard a sound that made the blood turn to ice in his veins. It was the sound of heavy boots in the hallway, moving with a rhythmic, military cadence. Then came the shouting and the sound of metal trays being overturned. The Falcons hadn't stayed on the street. They had followed the ambulances to the hospital. You are lying in that bed. You can't move your arm, and your head is spinning so fast you feel like you might vomit. You hear the door at the end of the ward burst open. You hear the screams of the nurses and the sound of more gunshots. You realize that the people who attacked you on the street are now moving from bed to bed, finishing the job they started. Do you try to roll off the mattress and hide in the narrow gap against the wall, knowing you might be trapped there? Or do you pull the white sheet over your head and pray that they think you are already a corpse? Because here is the thing. The people coming down the hall aren't looking for survivors. They are looking to erase every single witness. Carlos survived that day only because a doctor had the courage to shove his gurney into a dark supply closet and lock the door from the outside. He spent 6 hours huddled among boxes of gauze and bottles of saline, listening to the sounds of a massacre happening just a few feet away. By the time the hospital went quiet, an estimated 120 people were dead. Many of them were executed right there in their hospital beds, while the police and the military stood outside and did nothing. It was one of the darkest days in the history of Mexico, a state-sponsored slaughter that would become known as El Halconazo, or the Massacre of the Corpus Christi Thursday. The reveal that came out years later was even more chilling. The Falcons weren't a random group of thugs. They were an elite paramilitary unit, secretly funded and trained by the Mexican government specifically to suppress political dissent. They had been given specialized training in martial arts and urban combat, and they were coordinated through a shadow command structure that led directly to the highest levels of power. For decades, the government denied any involvement, burying the records and intimidating the survivors. It was a perfect, cold-blooded betrayal of the people by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them, leaving a scar on the national psyche that has never truly healed. Carlos never finished his engineering degree. The weight of what he had seen, the loss of Maria, whose body was never found, and the realization that his own government had tried to murder him, broke something inside of him that logic couldn't fix. He spent the rest of his life in the shadows, a ghost of the man who once built bridges. The massacre of 1971 was a prelude to the Dirty War, a period of disappearances and state terror that would haunt Mexico for years. It was a story of a silent, chemical fear that permeated every corner of society, much like the fear that was being used to break the minds of those who dared to speak out in the cold, sterile rooms of the Soviet Union. The survivors of the Mexico City massacre carried a physical and emotional trauma that defined their existence. It was a deep, internal wound that came from knowing that even your own home, your own streets, and your own hospitals were no longer safe. This sense of being hunted, of having your very reality manipulated by a powerful and unseen force, was a feeling that was being duplicated in other parts of the world. In the heart of Moscow, the state wasn't using bamboo sticks to silence dissidents. They were using something much more subtle and much more terrifying. They were using experimental drugs to reach inside a person's mind and shatter it from the inside out. In 1971, a brilliant dissident named Vladimir Bukovsky sat in a cold cell in the Vladimir Central Prison in the Soviet Union. He was a man who had committed no crime other than exposing the government's use of mental hospitals to torture political prisoners. But instead of a standard interrogation, Vladimir would be subjected to pharmacological interrogation, where doctors in white coats injected him with experimental drugs designed to shatter his consciousness. The mystery is not just how he survived the chemical assault, but why the KGB was so terrified of one man's words that they tried to erase his very mind. The air inside the concrete walls of Vladimir Central Prison didn't just feel cold. It felt sterile, like the inside of a giant, frozen lung. If you were sitting in one of those narrow cells in 1971, the first thing you would notice was the smell. It was a sharp, clinical scent of rubbing alcohol mixed with the underlying stench of damp stone and unwashed wool. The silence was so absolute that it had a physical weight to it, broken only by the chilling, rhythmic sound of a metal medical tray rattling against the bars of a cell door 3 levels down. It was a sound that didn't promise food or freedom, but something much more invasive. Vladimir Bukovsky was 29 years old, and he was a man who possessed a mind that the Soviet state considered a weapon of mass destruction. He wasn't a soldier or a spy. He was a writer and an activist who had spent the last decade documenting a terrifying new trend. The KGB had begun classifying political dissidents as mentally ill, locking them in psychiatric hospitals known as psychushkas. Vladimir's life was defined by a singular, burning passion for the truth. He was a man who loved the Russian language and the power of a well-placed argument. He was a son who wrote letters to his mother that were filled with quiet strength and a stubborn refusal to break. Before his final arrest in early 1971, Vladimir's life was a series of small, defiant acts. He spent his days meeting in smoke-filled kitchens with other writers, their voices low as they transcribed forbidden manuscripts by hand. He had a specific way of folding these papers into tiny squares that could be hidden in the lining of a coat. He enjoyed long walks through the parks of Moscow, despite knowing that every person he passed could be an informant. He was a man of high intelligence who could have been a leading scientist or a diplomat, but he chose instead to become the conscience of a nation that was trying very hard to forget its own soul. The routine inside the Vladimir Central Prison was designed to slowly grind a human being into dust. Every morning at 5:30, the heavy iron bolt on Vladimir's door would slide back with a sound like a gunshot. He would stand at attention while a guard with eyes like gray marble counted his few possessions. Then came the mundane stretch of the day. Vladimir would spend hours pacing the 3 steps across his cell and the 3 steps back. 1, 2, 3. Turn. 1, 2, 3, turn. He did this for so long that he wore a visible path into the concrete floor. It was a repetitive, hypnotic movement that served as his only defense against the crushing boredom of isolation. In the afternoons, the ritual shifted to the cleaning of the cell. Vladimir was given a small rag and a bucket of gray water. He would scrub every inch of the stone, focusing on the tiny cracks in the mortar as if he were trying to memorize the architecture of his own tomb. He would listen to the muffled sounds of the prison, the distant shouting of guards, the clatter of the soup cart, and the wind whistling through the high, barred windows. He found comfort in the mechanical nature of these tasks. As long as he was moving, as long as he was scrubbing or pacing, he felt like he was still in control of his own physical reality. He was anchoring himself to the smallness of his world. For months, this was his life. He ate the thin, salty cabbage soup and the hard black bread, savoring every crumb as if it were a feast. He would lay on his wooden cot at night and reconstruct entire books in his head, reciting the poetry of Mandelstam or the prose of Solzhenitsyn to the darkness. He felt that as long as his mind remained intact, the state had failed. He was a man who had survived the gulags before, and he believed he knew the limits of human endurance. But in late 1971, the atmosphere in the prison began to change. The guards were replaced by men who didn't carry batons, but wore white clinical coats over their uniforms. The subtle shift happened during a Tuesday morning inspection. Instead of the usual count, the door stayed open longer than usual. A man with a stethoscope around his neck walked in and didn't look at Vladimir's eyes. He looked at his veins. He didn't ask about Vladimir's health. He asked if Vladimir was still hearing voices of dissent. It was a question that didn't make any sense. Vladimir pointed out that he wasn't hearing voices. He was writing facts. The doctor just nodded slowly and made a note on a clipboard. It was a detail that felt logically out of place. This wasn't an interrogation. It was a diagnosis for a disease that Vladimir knew he didn't have. A few days later, 2 orderlies entered the cell and held Vladimir down. It wasn't a beating, it was a medical procedure. They pulled up his sleeve and injected a clear, sickly sweet-smelling liquid into his arm. The doctor called it an experimental sedative, but Vladimir knew better. This was the beginning of the pharmacological interrogation. Within minutes, the logic of the world started to misfire. The lines of the cell began to warp and stretch like hot plastic. The sound of the doctor's voice became a deafening, distorted roar that seemed to come from inside Vladimir's own skull. The primary weapon of the KGB was no longer the fist. It was the syringe. Your heart isn't just beating fast. It is fluttering in your chest like a bird with broken wings. You try to stand up, but your legs feel like they have been replaced by liquid lead. The walls of your cell, the stones you have spent months scrubbing, are now melting and dripping onto the floor. You try to remember your mother's face, but the image is being eaten away by a white, chemical static. You can feel your thoughts being pulled apart, one by one, like threads from a coat. You want to scream, but you can't remember how to move your jaw. You are being buried alive inside your own brain, and the people standing over you are watching with the cold curiosity of scientists. You are Vladimir Bukovsky. You are sitting in that chair, and you can feel the drugs surging through your nervous system. The doctor asks you again to admit that your writings were the result of a delusional mind. He tells you that if you just sign the paper, the injections will stop and you can go back to a real hospital. You can feel your resolve softening, the chemical fog making it so easy to just say yes. Do you fight to hold on to that one last scrap of truth, even as your memory of it vanishes? Or do you give in to the silence and let them take everything that makes you who you are? Because once you sign, the Vladimir Bukovsky who wrote those books is dead forever. The bizarre reveal of Vladimir's story didn't happen in the prison, but on the global stage. Despite months of chemical torture, he refused to break. He used the brief moments of lucidity between injections to write down the names of the drugs and the doctors, hiding the notes in the only place they couldn't search: his own internal sense of defiance. In 1976, his struggle became so famous that the Soviet government was forced to exchange him for Luis Korvalin, a Chilean communist leader. When Vladimir stepped onto the tarmac in Switzerland, He was a walking testament to the failure of punitive psychiatry. He had survived the worst the KGB could throw at him. Vladimir Bukovsky would spend the rest of his life in exile, becoming a professor at Cambridge and a tireless advocate for human rights. He had proven that even the most sophisticated chemical weapons couldn't erase a human soul if that soul was determined to stay awake. The documents he smuggled out led to a worldwide condemnation of the Soviet psychiatric system, forcing the government to eventually abandon the practice. He was a man who had gone into the heart of the machine and come out with his mind still his own. He had turned the cold, sterile air of the Vladimir prison into a megaphone that echoed around the entire world. The chemical fear that the KGB tried to use on Vladimir was a dark reflection of the silence and disappearances happening elsewhere in 1971. While a dissident in Moscow was fighting to keep his thoughts from melting, thousands of miles away in the bustling, neon-lit streets of Tokyo, a different kind of erasure was taking place. A young schoolgirl was standing on a crowded train station platform, surrounded by people, yet she was about to vanish so completely that it would feel as if she had been erased from the very fabric of reality. The transition from the iron cells of the Soviet Union to the train tracks of Japan would reveal a mystery just as cold. In 1971, a 16-year-old schoolgirl in Tokyo stood on a crowded train station platform, her backpack slung over her shoulder as she waited for her ride home. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, surrounded by hundreds of commuters in one of the safest cities in the world. But instead of stepping off at her stop, she would vanish into thin air, leaving behind no clues until months later when her belongings were found at a remote mountain shrine. The mystery is not just where she went, but why her items were placed in a sacred site miles from civilization, and whether she was taken by a shadow in the city or a ghost from across the sea. Tonight, I'm going to tell you 14 stories about people who encountered the strange, the dark, and the mysterious in ways they never could have prepared for. But before we get into our first case, if you could please do me a huge favor. If you enjoy these stories, please offer to buy the like button, a ticket for the late-night express train, and walk it to the edge of the platform. But the second the headlights appear in the tunnel, I want you to suddenly push it off the ledge and disappear into the crowd. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from today. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. Now, let us get into our story. The air in a Tokyo train station during the evening rush hour has a very specific mechanical pulse. If you were standing on the platform in 1971, the first thing you would notice wasn't the people, but the sound. It was a rhythmic, metallic clack-clack of the steel wheels against the rails, a noise that vibrated through your teeth and down into your marrow. Underneath that, there was the sharp, ozone smell of electricity sparking against the overhead wires and the damp, earthy scent of thousands of wet umbrellas. The city felt like a giant, breathing machine, and every person on that platform was just a tiny, anonymous cog moving in perfect, predictable synchronization with the clock on the wall. Sayuri was 16 years old, and she lived a life that was measured in train schedules and school bells. She was a student at a prestigious girls' academy, a place where the uniforms were always pressed and the expectations were even higher. Sayuri was the kind of girl who found beauty in the small things, like the way the ink flowed from her calligraphy brush or the specific shade of pink on the cherry blossoms in her family's garden. She had a cat named Mochi that waited for her at the front door every evening, and she spent her nights studying under a small desk lamp, dreaming of becoming a teacher. She was a daughter, a sister, and a girl who felt completely at home in the orderly world of Tokyo. Her room was a sanctuary of organized thoughts. She had a collection of small glass animals on her windowsill that she dusted every Saturday morning with a piece of silk. She kept her pens in a specific wooden box that her father had carved for her 10th birthday, arranged by color and length. Sayuri loved the feeling of a fresh notebook, the way the white pages promised a future that she was carefully building with every homework assignment. Her mother expected her to be home by 6:30 every evening, and Sayuri took pride in never being a minute late. She was a girl who understood the value of harmony and the comfort that comes from knowing exactly what the next hour of your life will look like. The commute from her school to her neighborhood was a 40-minute journey that Sayuri could have done with her eyes closed. Every afternoon at 5:45, she would walk through the heavy station gates, the sound of her ticket being punched by the attendant providing a sharp, familiar start to her trip. She would navigate the sea of black hair and dark blue suits, moving with a practiced grace through the crowds of businessmen. She had a favorite spot on the platform, right near the third pillar where the wind from the tunnel wasn't quite as cold. She would stand there, her backpack held in front of her, watching the digital display flip through the names of the coming trains. When the doors opened, she would step into the carriage and find a spot to stand near the window. The mundane stretch of the ride was a time for reflection. She would watch the neon lights of Shinjuku blur into a smear of red and green as the train picked up speed. She listened to the muffled announcements of the conductor, a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. The car was always crowded, but there was a strange kind of privacy in the anonymity. People avoided eye contact, buried in their newspapers, or staring at their own reflections in the glass. Sayuri would count the stops, her mind already moving ahead to the warm dinner waiting for her at home. The train would slow down at each station with a long, drawn-out hiss of the air brakes. Sayuri would watch the doors slide open and closed, a repetitive ritual that happened hundreds of times a day. She noticed the smell of the bento boxes being carried by the office workers and the faint scent of tobacco lingering on their coats. She would shift her weight from one foot to the other, her shoes making a quiet scuffing sound on the linoleum floor. The movement of the train was hypnotic, a gentle swaying that made the world outside feel like a movie being projected on a screen. For 16 years, this was the safest place she knew, a metal cocoon protected by the rules of society. As the train approached the outskirts of the city, the crowd began to thin out. By the time they reached the final 3 stops, Sayuri was often one of the few people left in her carriage. She would use this time to adjust her uniform or check her reflection in the dark window, making sure her hair was still in place. She enjoyed the transition from the frantic energy of the city center to the quiet, residential atmosphere of her neighborhood. The houses outside became smaller, the gardens more visible under the glow of the street lamps. She would start to gather her things, pulling the straps of her backpack tight, preparing to step out into the cool evening air and walk the final 2 blocks home. The subtle shift happened just as the train was pulling away from the station before her stop. Sayuri noticed that the lights in the carriage flickered once, then twice, leaving her in total darkness for a split second. When the lights came back on, they had a sickly yellow tint that made the interior of the car look like a faded photograph. She also noticed that the train wasn't slowing down for her station. In fact, it seemed to be picking up speed. She looked around, but the carriage was now completely empty. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was heavy and suffocating. Then, she saw a man standing at the far end of the car, watching her. He wasn't dressed like a commuter. The man was wearing a heavy dark coat that looked too warm for the season, and his face was partially obscured by the shadow of a brimmed hat. He wasn't holding a newspaper or a bag. He was just standing there, his hands buried deep in his pockets, staring at Sayuri with a flat, predatory intensity. The logic of the situation started to break down. The train was now moving through a part of the city Sayuri didn't recognize. The buildings were gone, replaced by dark, tangled forests and the jagged silhouettes of mountains against the purple sky. The rhythmic clack-clack of the wheels had changed to a frantic, uneven beat, as if the train were trying to outrun something in the dark. Your heart isn't just beating fast now, it is slamming against your ribs like a hammer. You stand up, intending to move to the next carriage, but your legs feel like they are made of water. You look toward the man, but he is closer now, having moved 5 rows of seats in the blink of an eye. The air in the car is suddenly freezing, and you can see your own breath blooming in front of your face like a white ghost. You try to reach for the emergency cord, but your fingers are numb and unresponsive. You want to scream for the conductor, but your throat is tight and dry. You are trapped in a speeding metal box with a shadow that has no name and no face. You look out the window, desperate to see a familiar landmark, but all you see is the reflection of the man standing right behind you. He doesn't say a word, but you can feel the cold radiating from his body. The train screeches to a violent halt, the sound of the brakes like 1,000 screaming voices. The doors slide open, and instead of your neighborhood station, you are staring out at a deserted, wooden platform in the middle of a dense forest. There are no lights, no signs, and no other people. Just the wind whistling through the tall pine trees and the smell of ancient, rotting leaves. The man gestures toward the darkness, and you realize with a jolt of terror that the journey home is over. You are standing on that platform. The train doors are still open behind you, the yellow light of the carriage spilling out onto the dirt. The forest is a wall of blackness, and the only sound is the rustle of the wind. The man is waiting for you to make a move. Do you try to run back onto the train and hide under a seat, hoping the doors will close and take you back to the city? Or do you step out into the woods, believing that your only chance for survival is to disappear into the trees before he can catch you? Because here is the thing, Sayuri never made it home. The train car was found empty at the end of the line, and she was nowhere to be found. The investigation into Sayuri's disappearance was one of the largest in the history of the Tokyo Metropolitan Police. They searched every inch of the tracks, interrogated hundreds of commuters, and even brought in divers to search the rivers near the rail lines. But there was nothing. No struggle, no witnesses, and no evidence of where she had gone. Her parents kept her room exactly as she had left it, the glass animals on the windowsill collecting dust as the weeks turned into months. The story of the schoolgirl who vanished from the safest train line in the world became a legend, a cautionary tale told to children about the shadows that live in the gaps between the stations. 6 months after she vanished, a group of hikers in the Chichibu Mountains, miles away from any train line, stumbled upon a remote mountain shrine. The shrine was old and neglected, hidden behind a thicket of bamboo. On the stone altar, laid out with a chilling, ritualistic precision, were Sayuri's belongings. Her school backpack was there, neatly closed. Beside it was her wooden pen box, and inside, the pens were still arranged by color and length. Her calligraphy brush was placed across the top, as if she had just finished a lesson. But there was no sign of Sayuri herself. No footprints, no clothing, and no remains. It was as if she had simply been unpacked and then erased. The bizarre reveal came years later when archival police reports suggested a terrifying possibility. During the 1970s, several young Japanese citizens had been abducted by North Korean agents who were infiltrating the coastlines and the cities to steal identities for their spies. These victims were often taken from public places and transported across the sea to training camps. The mountain shrine could have been a drop-off point, a place where the abductors left the physical traces of their victims' old lives before taking them into a world from which they would never return. Sayuri might not have been taken by a ghost, but by a government that specialized in making people disappear. The case of the girl at the station remains officially unsolved, a haunting reminder that even in a world of schedules and rules, there are cracks where the darkness can get in. Sayuri's story is a testament to the fragility of normalcy, the way a 16-year-old's life can be dismantled in the space between two stops. But while Sayuri was vanishing from a public train in Tokyo, thousands of miles away in a quiet suburb of New Jersey, a different kind of erasure was being planned. This one wouldn't happen in a forest or on a mountain, but inside a 19-room mansion. And the person doing the erasing wasn't a foreign agent, but the master of the house himself. In November of 1971, a devout Sunday school teacher named John List walked through his 19-room Victorian mansion in Westfield, New Jersey. He was a man of high standing, a successful accountant who appeared to have the perfect American life. But instead of sitting down for dinner with his wife and children, John would methodically shoot every single member of his family, turn on a classical music station, and vanish for nearly 2 decades. The mystery is not just the coldness of the act, but why he believed that killing his family was the only way to save their souls, and how he managed to start a whole new life while his face was being hunted by the entire country. The air inside the ballroom of Breeze Knoll was thick and heavy, smelling of old wood wax and the faint, sweet scent of rotting flowers from a forgotten vase. If you were standing there on that cold November night, the first thing you would notice wasn't the darkness, but the music. A high-pitched, elegant violin concerto was playing from a radio somewhere in the house, the notes bouncing off the high ceilings and the mahogany walls. It was a beautiful sound, but in the absolute silence of the mansion, it felt wrong. It was too bright, too cheerful. Underneath the music, there was a heavy, metallic smell hanging in the stagnant air, the kind of scent that stays in the back of your throat long after you leave. John List was 46 years old, and to everyone in his community, he was the embodiment of the American dream. He was a tall, serious man who wore thick-rimmed glasses and always had his shirt buttoned to the very top. He worked as an accountant, a job that suited his obsession with numbers and order. John didn't just attend church. He was a leader in his congregation, teaching Sunday school and advocating for traditional values. He was a man who believed that every problem had a logical solution and that life was a ledger that needed to be perfectly balanced. He was a provider, a protector, and a man who took great pride in the massive 3-story mansion where his family lived. Breeze Knoll was more than just a house. It was a 19-room monument to success. It had a grand ballroom with a stained glass skylight that was said to have been designed by Tiffany. John lived there with his wife Helen, his elderly mother Alma, and his 3 children, 16-year-old Patricia, 15-year-old John Jr., and 13-year-old Frederick. From the outside, the List family looked like a portrait of suburban bliss. They attended church functions together, the children were well behaved, and their lawn was always perfectly manicured. But inside those 19 rooms, the walls were starting to close in. John had lost his job and was secretly draining his mother's savings. The morning of November 9th, 1971, began with a routine that was as precise as a clock. John woke up at 6 o'clock, just as he did every other day of his life. He spent 15 minutes shaving, his movements slow and deliberate, making sure not to miss a single hair. He dressed in a crisp white shirt and a dark suit, adjusting his tie until it sat perfectly centered. He walked down the grand staircase, the wood creaking softly under his weight, and entered the kitchen. He made a pot of coffee and sat at the long oak table, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. This was his time for quiet reflection, a mundane stretch of time before the rest of the world woke up. He watched the sun rise through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the ballroom floor. When the children came down for breakfast, he greeted them with a nod, his face an unreadable mask of calm. He watched them eat their cereal, noting the way they talked about their upcoming school projects and their plans for the weekend. He listened to the sound of their spoons hitting the bowls and the rustle of the morning newspaper. To anyone else, it was just a normal Tuesday morning in a quiet New Jersey suburb. There was no shouting, no tension, no sign that the man at the head of the table was mentally preparing to dismantle the world he had spent 20 years building. After the children left for school, John spent the next hour performing his usual chores. He took out the trash, making sure the bags were neatly tied. He checked the mail, sorting the bills into a pile on his desk. He walked through each room of the mansion, checking the locks on the windows and the temperature on the thermostats. He was a man who valued maintenance above all else. He even took the time to wipe a smudge off the Tiffany skylight in the ballroom. He was moving with a slow, mechanical rhythm, his mind focused on the small, repetitive tasks of homeownership. He felt a sense of peace in the routine, even as the handgun waited in the drawer of his mahogany desk. He spent a long time in his mother's apartment on the 3rd floor, helping her with her morning tea. They talked about the weather and the upcoming holidays. John was patient and attentive, the perfect son. He adjusted the pillows on her armchair and made sure her radio was tuned to her favorite station. He listened to her talk about the past, his expression never flickering. He was anchoring himself in the normalcy of their relationship, reinforcing the idea that he was doing what was best for her. He walked back down to the kitchen, the sound of his leather shoes on the hardwood floor being the only thing that broke the silence of the massive house. It was a morning like 1,000 others. The subtle shift happened around 10 o'clock. John went down to the basement, not to check the furnace or the water heater, but to open a heavy metal safe. Inside were 2 handguns, a 9mm Steyr and a .22 caliber revolver. He took them both out and placed them on a workbench. He spent the next 20 minutes cleaning the barrels, the smell of gun oil mixing with the damp scent of the basement. This was a detail that was logically out of place for a Tuesday morning. He wasn't planning a trip to the shooting range. He checked the ammunition, counting the rounds out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. He loaded each weapon with a slow, steady hand, his face devoid of emotion. He walked back upstairs, but he didn't go to his office. He went to the kitchen where his wife, Helen, was having her morning coffee. She was sitting by the window, looking out at the garden. John stood behind her for a moment, watching the way the light caught the gray in her hair. He didn't say anything. He didn't hug her or tell her he loved her. He just reached into his pocket and pulled out the 9mm. The logic in his brain had completely shifted. He believed that the world was becoming too sinful, that his family was losing their way, and that the only way to ensure their place in heaven was to end their lives while they were still in a state of grace. Your heart isn't just beating fast now. It is slamming against your ribs like a prisoner trying to break out of a cell. You are sitting in that grand mansion, surrounded by beautiful things, and the man who is supposed to protect you is standing in the doorway with a gun. You can feel the cold sweat on your palms and the sudden, sharp metallic taste of fear in your mouth. The air in the room feels thick, like you are trying to breathe through a wet cloth. You look at your father, the man who taught you how to ride a bike and how to say your prayers, and you realize that his eyes are completely empty. There is no anger there, no hatred, just a terrifying, cold sense of duty. You try to speak, to ask him what he is doing, but your voice is stuck in your throat. The silence of the 19-room house is no longer peaceful. It is a suffocating weight. You hear the sharp, mechanical click of the hammer being pulled back. It is a sound that shouldn't exist in a home like this. You look around the room, at the family photos on the wall and the comfortable chairs, and you realize that the normalcy you took for granted was just a thin veil. The man standing there isn't your father anymore. He is a judge, a jury, and an executioner who has decided that your time on this earth is over. You close your eyes, and the last thing you hear is the elegant violin music. You are Patricia, or John Jr., or Frederick. You have just walked through the front door of your beautiful home after a long day at school. The house is quiet, but the radio is playing a classical concerto. You call out for your mother, but there is no answer. You see your father standing in the ballroom, and he tells you to come here, that he has something to show you. Do you trust the man who has raised you, even though the atmosphere in the house feels freezing cold? Or do you notice the way his hand is tucked behind his back and run for the door? Because here is the thing. John List had already killed his wife and his mother. He was just waiting for the children to come home to finish the ledger. The bizarre reveal of the John List case didn't come until the police finally entered the house nearly a month later. They found the bodies of the wife and children laid out on sleeping bags in the ballroom, arranged with a chilling, ritualistic precision. But John's mother was found in her third-floor apartment. The most disturbing detail, however, was in the family photographs. John had taken the time to go through every single album in the mansion and cut his own face out of every picture. He didn't want to leave a single image of himself behind. He then wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor, explaining that he had killed them to save their souls from a sinful world before simply walking out the front door. John List vanished so completely that he became a ghost. He changed his name to Robert Clark, moved to Colorado, and started an entirely new life. He got a job as an accountant, joined a new church, and even got married again. For 18 years, he lived as a respected member of his community, his new wife having no idea that she was living with a man who had annihilated his entire family. He believed he had gotten away with it, that the ledger was balanced, and his past was erased. But in 1989, the television show America's Most Wanted aired a segment on the case, featuring a forensic bust of what John List might look like as an older man. It was a perfect match. The master of the house was finally brought to justice 18 years after the music stopped playing at Breeze Knoll. He was captured in Virginia, still living his quiet, mundane life. He never showed remorse, maintaining until his death in 2008 that his actions were a necessary sacrifice for his family's spiritual well-being. His story remains one of the most haunting examples of how a man can hide a monster behind a mask of devout normalcy. But while John List was methodically erasing his identity in a New Jersey mansion, the international stage was preparing for a very different kind of horror. The world was about to see how a place of global peace could be turned into a slaughterhouse. The transition from the private madness of John List to the public tragedy of the Munich Olympics is a journey from one form of absolute conviction to another. Both involved men who believed their violent actions were serving a higher purpose, and both shattered the illusion of safety in places where people felt most protected. In 1972, the eyes of the entire world would turn toward West Germany, expecting to see the best of humanity. Instead, they would witness a televised nightmare that would prove that no fence, no matter how high, could keep out the shadows of a world at war. The peace of the games was about to be broken by a sound that would echo much louder than a violin concerto. In September of 1972, a group of world-class athletes from Israel were resting in their dormitories at the Olympic Village in Munich, celebrating the spirit of global peace. They were exactly where every athlete dreams of being, surrounded by the best in the world. But instead of competing for gold, they would be taken hostage by 8 militants who scaled a fence in the middle of the night. The mystery is not just the failure of the rescue attempt, but how the cheerful games turned into a televised slaughterhouse, and how this event changed the way the world fights terror forever. The night air in Munich was surprisingly cool for September, carrying the faint, clean scent of cut grass from the nearby Olympic Stadium. If you were standing near the chain-link fence surrounding the Olympic Village at 4 o'clock in the morning, the first thing you would notice was the absolute silence of a city at rest. But then, a very specific sound would have cut through the darkness. It was the muffled, rhythmic squeak of rubber sneakers gripping the metal wire of the fence. It was a soft, sliding sound, followed by the heavy, dull thud of boots hitting the damp turf on the other side. Underneath that soft landing, there was another sound, much sharper and more final. It was the distinct, metallic click of a selector switch on an assault rifle being moved from safe to semi-automatic. It was a cold, mechanical noise that didn't belong in a place dedicated to international friendship. The air seemed to grow heavy with the smell of gun oil and the sweat of men who had been waiting in the shadows for months. The silence that followed was no longer peaceful. It was a pressurized void, a moment of calm before a storm that would be broadcast into every living room on the entire planet. Josef Gutfreund was 41 years old, and he was a man who lived for the sport of wrestling. He was a giant of a man, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could crush stones. At the Munich Olympics, he wasn't there to compete, but to serve as a referee, a role that required absolute focus and a deep respect for the rules. Josef was known for his booming laugh and his ability to make everyone feel safe in his presence. He was a father of 2 daughters, a man who loved his family and his country, and he believed that the Olympic Village was one of the few truly sacred places left in a violent world. The atmosphere in the Israeli quarters at 31 Connollystrasse was one of exhausted satisfaction. The games were well underway, and the athletes were balanced between the high pressure of competition and the relief of being among friends. They spent their evenings in the communal areas, sharing stories of their training and joking about the local food. There was a sense of profound camaraderie, a feeling that they were part of a global family. The security at the village was famously relaxed, almost non-existent, because the organizers wanted to show the world that West Germany was now a place of peace. The mundane stretch of the night followed a familiar pattern. Josef and his teammates had spent the evening celebrating a successful day, the sound of their laughter echoing through the narrow hallways of their apartment. By midnight, the lights were dimmed, and the only sound was the low, steady hum of the ventilation system. Josef lay in his bed, his large frame filling the small dormitory cot. He listened to the rhythmic breathing of his roommates, a sound that usually lulled him to sleep. He was a man of habit, and he found comfort in the predictable quiet of the Olympic Village after a long day of work. He spent a long time staring at the ceiling, thinking about the matches he would be refereeing the next day. He mentally rehearsed the rules and the hand signals, his mind moving with the precision of a professional. Outside, the world was a blur of street lamps and shadows, but inside the apartment, everything was in its right place. He could hear the faint rustle of the sheets as one of his teammates turned over in their sleep. He felt a deep sense of normalcy, an anchoring belief that he was safe in this concrete sanctuary. He eventually drifted off, his large hands resting peacefully on his chest. The hours passed with a slow, agonizing crawl. At 4:30 in the morning, the building was a tomb of silence. The only movement was the soft, creeping shadows in the hallway, as 8 men in tracksuits moved toward apartment number 1. They weren't running. They were gliding, their movements synchronized and silent. They reached the door and produced a set of stolen keys. The metal of the key whispered against the lock, a tiny, insignificant sound that should have gone unnoticed. But Josef Gutfreund was a man whose instincts had been sharpened by years on the wrestling mat. He was a light sleeper. The subtle shift happened when Josef heard a sound that didn't fit the logic of the building. It wasn't the hum of the air or the breathing of his friends. It was a faint, metallic scratching at the front door of the apartment. It was a sound that suggested someone was trying to be quiet, which in the middle of the night was the most suspicious thing of all. Josef didn't go back to sleep. He sat up slowly, his muscles tensing, his eyes fixed on the sliver of light under the door. He watched as a shadow blocked that light, and then he saw the doorknob begin to turn, inch by agonizing inch. He knew that none of his teammates were expected back at this hour. He knew that the coaches were already in their rooms. The logic of the situation was clear. Someone was breaking in. Josef didn't call out for a guard or look for a weapon. He threw his entire 300-pound frame against the door, just as it began to open. He could feel the weight of several men pushing from the other side, their boots scuffing against the linoleum in the hallway. He screamed a warning to his roommates, his voice a raw, primal roar that shattered the peace of the village. For a few seconds, he was the only thing standing between his friends and a nightmare. Your heart isn't just beating fast now. It is slamming against your ribs like a sledgehammer hitting a brick wall. You are pushing against that door with every ounce of strength you have, your feet sliding on the floor, your breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. You can see the barrel of a submachine gun poking through the narrow gap, the cold steel glinting in the dim light of the hallway. You know that if you let go, the people behind you are dead. You can feel the sheer, overwhelming force of the men on the other side, and you realize that this isn't a prank or a simple robbery. This is a war that has come into your bedroom. You can hear your teammates waking up behind you, the sounds of their confusion and panic filling the room. You tell them to run, to jump out the windows, to do anything but stay here. The pressure on the door is becoming unbearable, and your muscles are starting to scream in protest. You look at the gun barrel, and you realize that you are staring into the face of a hatred you can't even begin to understand. Your world has shrunk down to this one door and this one moment of resistance. You feel a sudden, sharp pain as the door is forced open just enough for a boot to wedge inside, and you know that your strength is finally running out. You are Gad Sobol, or Shal Ladny. You have just been jolted awake by a scream that sounds like a man being torn apart. You see your friend Josef straining against the door, his face purple with effort. You see the black barrels of guns appearing in the gap. Do you stay and try to help him, knowing you have no weapons and no chance against 8 armed militants? Or do you take the only exit available, the window, and pray that you can disappear into the darkness before they see you? Because here is the thing. Josef Gutfreund held that door for just a few seconds, but those seconds were the difference between life and death for some of the men in that room. The terrorists eventually forced their way in, and the apartment became a scene of absolute chaos. They moved from room to room with a terrifying, practiced efficiency, rounding up the athletes and tying their hands with heavy cords. 2 of the Israelis fought back with their bare hands, but they were gunned down in front of their teammates. The remaining 9 hostages were huddled together in a small room, while the world outside began to wake up to a televised nightmare. For the next 20 hours, the eyes of billions of people were fixed on 31 Kanalerstrasse, watching the masked figures on the balconies and waiting for a resolution that would never come. The bizarre reveal of the Munich massacre was the total and complete failure of the West German authorities to prepare for such an event. Despite receiving warnings that something might happen during the games, they had no specialized counter-terrorism unit. When they finally attempted a rescue at the Furstenfeldbruck air base, they used regular police officers who had no experience in sniper operations or hostage negotiations. The snipers were positioned in places where they couldn't see the targets, and they were given the wrong equipment. The entire operation was a tragic comedy of errors that resulted in the deaths of all 9 hostages, 5 terrorists, and 1 police officer. The aftermath of that night changed the world. Israel launched Operation Wrath of God, a years-long campaign to track down and assassinate every person involved in the planning of the Munich hit. West Germany created GSG-9, an elite unit that would set the standard for modern counterterrorism. But the scars on the Olympic movement were permanent. The cheerful games were over, replaced by a new era of high-security fences and armed guards. The tragedy of 1972 was a reminder that even in a place of global unity, the shadows of regional conflicts can reach out and touch anyone. The peace of the stadium had been replaced by the silence of the cemetery. The tragedy in Munich was a story of men being hunted by other men in a place of supposed safety. It was a struggle for survival against a human enemy, where the rules of the world were discarded for the sake of a political statement. But while the world was mourning the loss of the Israeli athletes, another struggle for survival was about to begin in a place where there were no men to fight, only the cold, indifferent power of nature. On a remote glacier in the Andes Mountains, a group of young men were about to realize that the human spirit can endure things that are far more terrifying than a gunman at the door. The transition from the violence of Munich to the white void of the Andes is a journey from the terror of the known to the horror of the unknown. In Germany, the threat was specific and visible. In the mountains of South America, the threat was the very air they breathed and the ground they walked on. The athletes in Munich fought for seconds of time. The rugby players in the Andes would have to fight for 72 days. They were about to enter a world where the only way to stay alive was to break the ultimate taboo of humanity, a crime against nature that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In October of 1972, a young rugby player named Nando Parado boarded a flight over the Andes Mountains with his teammates and family. They were exactly where they wanted to be, full of energy and excitement for an upcoming match in Chile. But instead of landing in Santiago, their plane would clip a mountain peak and crash onto a remote glacier. The mystery is not just how they survived for 72 days in sub-zero temperatures, but the horrific choice they had to make when their food ran out, a choice that would force them to consume the only thing left, their own friends. The air at 11,000 feet on a remote glacier in the Andes doesn't just feel cold, it feels like it is trying to strip the life right out of your skin. If you were standing there in the middle of October, the first thing you would notice wasn't the silence, but the blinding, painful whiteness of the snow that reflects the sun like 1,000 serrated knives. Underneath that light, there was the constant, deafening roar of the wind whipping through the jagged remains of a shattered airplane fuselage. It was a high-pitched, relentless shriek that sounded like the mountain itself was screaming in a language made of ice and ancient stone. Nando Parado was 22 years old, and he was a man who seemed to have the entire world in front of him. He was a tall, athletic rugby player for the Old Christians Club, a team made up of former students from a Catholic school in Montevideo, Uruguay. Nando was known for his quiet strength and his deep devotion to his mother and sister, who were both traveling with him on the flight. He spent his days in a blur of practice sessions, university classes, and long dinners with his close-knit group of friends. He was a son and a teammate who believed that, as long as they were together, they could overcome any obstacle on the field or off it. His life before the crash was a series of predictable, joyful rituals. Every Sunday, he would attend Mass with his family, the smell of incense and the sound of the choir providing a comforting backdrop to his week. He spent his Saturday afternoons on the rugby pitch, the physical exertion and the camaraderie of the scrum being the highlight of his existence. He loved the specific feeling of the grass under his cleats and the way the team would sing songs on the bus rides back from their matches. He was anchored in a world of tradition, faith, and the simple, indestructible bonds of friendship that defined his social circle in Uruguay. The flight started as a mundane stretch of time, filled with laughter and jokes. The 45 passengers on the Uruguayan Air Force, Flight 571, were mostly young men in their early 20s, and the atmosphere inside the cabin was electric. Nando spent the first hour talking with his friends about their upcoming games and the parties they planned to attend in Santiago. He watched the way the sunlight glinted off the silver wings of the Fairchild turboprop and listened to the steady, reassuring drone of the engines. It was a repetitive, hypnotic sound that made the idea of a disaster seem like a physical impossibility. As they flew deeper into the mountains, the routine of the flight continued. Nando watched the flight attendants move up and down the aisle, serving small snacks and coffee. He adjusted his seat, trying to find a comfortable position to nap, his mind wandering to the beautiful view of the peaks outside. He listened to the muffled chatter of his teammates, their voices a constant, friendly hum that filled the cramped cabin. He felt a deep sense of security, believing that the pilots were seasoned professionals who had flown this route dozens of times. He was resting in the normalcy of a commercial flight, unaware that the cockpit was filled with confusion. The first sign that something was logically out of place happened when the plane began to enter a thick bank of clouds. Nando noticed that the turbulence was getting worse, the aircraft shaking with a violent, jarring motion that made the overhead bins rattle. He looked out the window and saw that they were much closer to the jagged mountain peaks than they should have been. The pilot announced that they were beginning their descent into Santiago, but the logic didn't match the landscape. They were still surrounded by white peaks on all sides. Nando felt a slight prickle of unease on the back of his neck as the plane suddenly dropped hundreds of feet in a second. Then, the world turned into a chaotic blur of metal and screaming. The right wing of the plane clipped a hidden ridge, shearing off instantly and taking the tail section with it. The fuselage, now just a hollow tube of aluminum, slammed into a steep glacier and began to slide down the mountain like a high-speed toboggan. Nando felt the incredible G-forces pinning him into his seat, the sound of the wind through the open back of the plane drowning out everything else. He saw his friends being sucked out into the void, their screams lost in the roar of the engines. Then, everything went black as the fuselage finally came to a violent, crushing halt. Your heart isn't just beating fast now, it is slamming against your ribs like a sledgehammer hitting a frozen wall. You wake up in total darkness, smelling the sharp, chemical scent of jet fuel and the metallic tang of blood. You try to move, but your legs are pinned under a pile of twisted seats and luggage. The cold is immediate and terrifying, a physical weight that makes it hard to draw a full breath. You hear the moans of your friends in the shadows, and you realize that the world you knew just 10 minutes ago is gone forever. You are trapped in a metal tomb at 12,000 feet, and the only thing outside is a vertical wilderness of ice. You spend the next few days in a state of shock, trying to tend to the wounded with nothing but scraps of clothing and melted snow. You watch as your mother and then your sister pass away in your arms, the pain of their loss feeling heavier than the cold. You look out at the horizon, waiting for a rescue plane that never comes. The hunger begins as a dull ache in your stomach, but it soon transforms into a sharp, gnawing beast that devours your thoughts. You have finished the tiny scraps of chocolate and the single tin of crackers. There is nothing left to eat but the snow, and you know that your body is starting to consume itself from the inside out. You are Nando Parado. You are standing on that glacier, looking at the bodies of your friends who didn't survive the impact. You know that if you don't eat, you will die within days. You also know that the only source of protein for hundreds of miles is the flesh of those who are already gone. Do you choose to starve to death and maintain your moral dignity, or do you take a small piece of glass and do the unthinkable to survive another night? Because here is the thing. The decision wasn't just about you. It was about the survivors who were looking to you for leadership. You make the first cut, and the taste of the frozen meat is a betrayal of everything you were taught. The bizarre reveal of the Andes disaster wasn't just the survival cannibalism, but the incredible feat of human endurance that led to their rescue. After 2 months on the glacier, the survivors heard on a small transistor radio that the search had been officially called off. They were dead to the world. Nando Parado and Roberto Canessa realized that no one was coming for them. With no mountain gear, wearing only layers of thin rugby clothes, they decided to climb the highest peak in front of them. They hiked for 10 days across the most brutal terrain on Earth, crossing 60 miles of vertical ice until they finally spotted a man on horseback across a river in Chile. The 16 survivors who were pulled off that mountain in December of 1972 were walking miracles, but they were also the subjects of an intense global controversy. When the truth of how they stayed alive was revealed, the Catholic Church and the legal systems of South America had to grapple with the definition of necessity. It was eventually ruled that their actions were a form of survival that didn't constitute a crime, but the psychological scars remained. They had lived through a 72-day nightmare that proved the human spirit is capable of endure the impossible, even if it meant breaking the most sacred taboos of civilization. The story of the Andes survivors is a testament to the raw, primal will to live. It was a struggle against a silent, frozen enemy that required a level of mental and physical resilience that most people can't even imagine. But while Nando was climbing those peaks to save his friends, another kind of struggle for survival was taking place in the halls of power in Washington, D.C. This one didn't involve glaciers or cannibalism, but it did involve a group of men who were willing to do whatever it took to stay on top. The crash in the Andes was a fight against nature, but the scandal at the Watergate complex was a fight against the truth itself. The transition from the white void of the mountains to the wood-paneled offices of the American Capitol is a journey from a survival of the body to a survival of a reputation. In the Andes, the survivors broke the rules of nature to stay alive. In Washington, a president and his men were breaking the rules of the Constitution to stay in power. Both stories involved a group of people who believed they were in a situation where the normal rules no longer applied. In 1972, the world was about to see that a simple piece of tape on a door could be just as destructive as a plane wing clipping a mountain peak. In June of 1972, 5 men in business suits crept through the halls of the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C., carrying sophisticated bugging equipment. They were professional operators, working for the most powerful man in the world. But instead of a clean operation, they would be caught by a security guard who noticed a small piece of tape on a door. The mystery is not just the break-in itself, but why a president with a massive lead would risk everything for a third-rate burglary that would eventually force him to resign. The air in the 6th-floor hallway of the Watergate office building on that Saturday night didn't smell like a place where history was being made. It smelled like the dull, chemical scent of fresh floor wax and the faint, dusty aroma of stale air from a ventilation system that had been running for 12 hours straight. In the absolute quiet of the midnight shift, the only sound was the low, steady hum of the massive air conditioning units, a white noise so constant that it felt like part of the silence. It was a sterile, boring environment where nothing ever happened. Underneath that mechanical hum, if you were listening very closely, you might have heard the soft, rhythmic clicking of a pair of leather shoes on the linoleum. It was a slow, steady pace, the sound of someone who wasn't in a hurry because they had walked this exact path 1,000 times before. There was also the faint jingle of a heavy ring of brass keys hanging from a leather belt, a sharp, metallic sound that cut through the darkness like a tiny bell. The darkness in the corridor was thick, broken only by the occasional green glow of an exit sign over a door. Frank Wills was 24 years old, and he was a man who appreciated the simple predictability of his job. He was a security guard at the Watergate, a massive concrete complex that housed some of the most powerful political offices in the country. Frank was a quiet, diligent young man who didn't care much for the high-stakes games of Washington. He liked the solitude of the night shift and the way the building felt like his own private kingdom once the sun went down. He was a man who did his duty with a calm, methodical focus that most people his age lacked. His life was built on a foundation of steady, unglamorous habits. Every night at precisely midnight, he would arrive at the security desk, sign his name in the heavy ledger with a blue ballpoint pen, and check the monitors. He would spend the next 8 hours walking the miles of corridors, checking every door handle and every lock. He found comfort in the repetition, the way the building responded to his touch. He knew every creak in the floorboards and every shadow that the streetlights cast through the windows. He was the anchor of normalcy in a city built on secrets. The mundane stretch of his night began like every other shift he had worked for the past year. He would start on the ground floor and work his way up, floor by floor, in a slow ascending spiral. He would shine his heavy flashlight down the long, empty hallways, the beam of light dancing across the doors of law firms and political consultants. He would stop at each fire door, grasp the cold metal handle, and give it a firm tug. If it was locked, he would move on. It was a repetitive, hypnotic ritual that allowed his mind to wander to his plans for his next day off. He spent a long time on the second floor, checking the offices of the Democratic National Committee. The rooms were dark, the desks covered in stacks of paper and silent telephones. He would walk past the reception desk, the smell of old coffee and ink lingering in the air. He would check the deadbolts on the heavy glass doors, his flashlight reflecting off the surface like a second moon. To Frank, these were just offices, no different from the ones on the 4th or 5th floors. He didn't think about the secrets inside the filing cabinets. He just cared if the door caught. As the hours passed, the routine became almost automatic. He would walk 10 paces, check a door, walk another 10 paces, and check the next one. He listened to the sound of his own breath and the occasional muffled siren from the streets outside. The building was a concrete fortress, and he was its silent guardian. He felt a deep sense of security in the predictable nature of his rounds. He believed that, as long as he followed the rules and checked every lock, nothing could go wrong. He was anchored in the mundane, unaware that the world outside was about to explode. The subtle shift happened around 1 o'clock in the morning. Frank reached the door leading from the stairwell to the 6th floor parking garage and noticed something that didn't fit the logic of the building. There was a small, 2-inch piece of masking tape stuck over the bolt of the door lock. It was placed horizontally, preventing the latch from clicking into place. Frank stared at it for a moment, his flashlight beam fixed on the white strip. He assumed a maintenance worker had left it there to keep the door open while moving equipment. It was a small, logical deviation. He didn't think much of it. He reached out, peeled the tape off the metal, and put it in his pocket. He then pulled the door shut, heard the satisfying clack of the lock engaging, and continued his rounds. He went back down to the lobby, grabbed a snack, and sat at the desk for a while, watching the empty street. But the logic in his brain wouldn't let the tape go. Something about it felt too deliberate, too neat. He decided to go back up and check that specific door one more time, just to be sure. It was a gut feeling, a tiny prickle of unease that he couldn't ignore. When he reached the 6th floor again, 20 minutes later, he stopped in his tracks. His flashlight beam hit the lock, and there it was again. A fresh piece of masking tape had been placed over the bolt in exactly the same way. The door was once again unlocked. Frank felt a cold chill wash over him. He knew he was the only guard on duty, and he hadn't seen anyone else in the building. The tape hadn't been left by a forgetful janitor. Someone was inside the Watergate, and they were actively undoing his work. The mundane night had suddenly turned into something very dark. Your heart isn't just beating fast now. It is slamming against your ribs like a hammer against a steel plate. You are standing in a dark stairwell, holding a piece of tape in your hand, and you realize that you aren't alone. The silence of the building, which felt so comforting just an hour ago, now feels like a physical threat. Every shadow looks like a man, and every hum of the air conditioner sounds like a footstep. You can feel the sweat trickling down your spine, and the weight of your flashlight feels like a lead pipe in your hand. You are 24, and you are in way over your head. You look at the tape door and you realize that whoever did this is a professional. They aren't looking for a television to steal. They are here for something much more important. The air in the stairwell feels heavy, and your throat is so dry that it hurts to swallow. You want to run back down to the lobby and lock yourself in the booth, but your sense of duty won't let you. You are the only thing standing between the intruders and whatever they are after. You pull the radio from your belt, your fingers trembling, and you realize that your life is about to change forever. You are Frank Wills. You have a choice to make. Do you shrug your shoulders, remove the tape again, and walk away, pretending you didn't see anything? Or do you call the police and report a burglary in a building full of the country's most powerful secrets? Because here is the thing. If you call it in, you are starting a chain of events that will reach all the way to the Oval Office. You are about to pull a thread that will unravel the entire presidency of the United States. Do you trust your eyes, or do you trust the system that tells you everything is fine? Frank made the call. The bizarre reveal of the Watergate burglary was that the 5 men caught inside the DNC offices weren't random criminals. They were members of a secret unit known as the Plumbers, and they were led by former CIA and FBI agents. They were caught with cameras, bugging devices, and thousands of dollars in sequentially numbered bills that were traced back to President Nixon's re-election committee. It wasn't just a break-in, it was a state-sponsored espionage operation designed to sabotage political opponents. It was a crime committed by the very people who were supposed to uphold the law. The investigation that followed turned into the greatest political scandal in American history. It revealed a culture of paranoia and corruption within the White House, including a secret taping system that recorded every conversation in the Oval Office. When the smoking gun tape was finally released, it proved that President Nixon had personally ordered the CIA to block the FBI investigation into the burglary. Faced with certain impeachment, Nixon became the first and only U.S. president to resign in disgrace on August 9, 1974, all because of a piece of tape. Frank Wills became a national hero for a brief moment, but his life never recovered from the weight of that night. He struggled to find work in security again, as many firms viewed him as a liability for having exposed the powerful. He died in poverty in 2000, a man who had changed the course of history by simply doing his job. The Watergate scandal left a permanent scar on the American psyche, a deep-seated distrust of government that still lingers today. It was a story of how a small, mundane detail can bring down the most powerful man in the world if someone has the courage to notice it. The fall of a president in Washington was a slow, legal explosion that took years to unfold. It was a struggle for power and reputation that took place in courtrooms and on television screens. But while the American Capitol was reeling from the fallout of the Watergate scandal, on the other side of the Atlantic, a much more violent kind of explosion was about to occur. In the streets of Belfast, Northern Ireland, the struggle wasn't over tapes or documents, but over the very ground people walked on. The political chaos in America was a mirror to the physical chaos that was about to erupt in a city under siege. The transition from the sterile halls of the Watergate to the blood-stained streets of Belfast is a journey from a war of words to a war of fire. In Washington, the weapons were subpoenas and investigations. In Northern Ireland, the weapons were 22 bombs and a timer that was ticking down toward a Friday rush hour. Both stories involved a group of people who believed that their cause justified the absolute destruction of their enemies. In July of 1972, the world was about to see that some secrets don't just lead to a resignation, they lead to a massacre that the world would never forget. In July of 1972, the city of Belfast was bustling with people finishing their Friday shopping. They were exactly where they were every week, moving through the familiar streets of their hometown. But instead of a quiet evening, the city would be rocked by 22 bombs in just 80 minutes. The mystery is why the IRA sent so many warnings that they knew the police would be too overwhelmed to save everyone, turning the streets into a minefield. The coordination of the attack was as terrifying as it was precise. The air in the center of Belfast on that Friday afternoon was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust and the salty, damp breeze blowing in from the harbor. If you were standing near the bus station on Oxford Street, the first thing you would notice was the constant, low-frequency hum of a city in motion. But underneath the sound of the engines, there was a distant, hollow thud that didn't belong. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through the pavement, followed by a silence that was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against your eardrums. The smell of the city began to change almost immediately. The familiar scent of roasting coffee from the nearby shops was replaced by something sharp and acrid. It was the smell of pulverized concrete and old brick dust, a dry, choking cloud that hung in the air and coated the back of your throat. Then came the sirens, a high-pitched, wailing chorus that seemed to be coming from every direction at once. The atmosphere was no longer that of a busy marketplace. It had turned into a pressurized void where every breath felt like a gamble against the unseen. Stephen was 34 years old and worked as a clerk at a hardware store near the Smithfield Market. He was a man who appreciated the resilience of his neighbors. Living through the troubles had taught him how to keep his head down and his eyes open. He was a husband and a father to a 5-year-old boy named Liam, and his entire world revolved around the small brick house on the outskirts of the city. He was a man of simple pleasures, like a cold pint after a long shift and the sound of his son's laughter when they played football in the narrow backyard. His life was defined by the predictable rhythms of a working-class man in Northern Ireland. Every morning, He would kiss his wife goodbye, walk the same 3 blocks to the bus stop, and nod to the same group of commuters. He found a sense of peace in the mundane nature of his work, the way he would organize the bins of nails and the rows of hammers by weight and size. He was an anchor of normalcy in a city that often felt like it was teetering on the edge of a cliff. He believed that if he just followed his routine, the violence would stay on the news. The Friday rush hour in Belfast was a repetitive, almost hypnotic ritual. People would stream out of the offices and factories, their faces tired but relieved that the work week was finally over. The sound of thousands of feet on the pavement created a steady, rhythmic backdrop to the evening. Stephen spent the last hour of his shift checking the inventory and sweeping the floor, the straw broom making a satisfying, dry sound against the concrete. He enjoyed the transition from the busy energy of the day to the quiet preparation for the trip back home to his family. He watched the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking with a mechanical precision. He noticed the way the light from the setting sun caught the dust motes dancing in the air of the shop. He listened to the muffled chatter of the customers as they made their final purchases, their voices a friendly, familiar hum. He felt a deep sense of security in the predictable nature of his environment. He believed that the rules of the city, however fragile, would hold for another day. He was resting in the mundane, unaware that a series of timers were already counting down. For 80 minutes, the city of Belfast was subjected to a logistical nightmare that was designed to break the will of its people. The first bomb went off at 2 to 10 in the afternoon near the Northern Counties railway station. Then, every few minutes, another explosion would rock a different part of the city. There was a bomb at a bus station, a bomb at a bridge, and a bomb at a shopping center. The sheer volume of the attacks was overwhelming, creating a sense of total, inescapable chaos. Stephen stood at the door of his shop, watching the smoke rise in the distance. He watched the police and the army units racing through the streets, their faces etched with a mix of exhaustion and sheer terror. He heard the sound of glass shattering blocks away, a delicate, tinkling noise that was followed by the screams of the injured. The mundane routine of the afternoon had been replaced by a frantic, desperate scramble for safety. People were running in every direction, their shopping bags forgotten on the sidewalks. The city felt like a living organism that was being attacked from within, its vital organs being systematically destroyed. The atmosphere in the hardware store was now charged with a silent, heavy tension. Stephen and his boss moved the heavy displays away from the windows, their movements quick and uncoordinated. They didn't talk, they just focused on the physical work, trying to distract themselves from the sounds outside. Stephen could feel the sweat trickling down his spine, and his hands were shaking just enough to make the metal handles of the bins rattle. He was anchored in the defense of his small world, believing that if he stayed inside, the storm would eventually pass over him. The subtle shift happened when a police officer ran past the door, shouting for everyone to evacuate toward the square. Stephen noticed that the officer's uniform was covered in a fine layer of gray dust, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, unfocused energy. It was a detail that didn't fit the logic of a controlled evacuation. The officer wasn't leading people to a safe zone. He was just pushing them away from one danger without knowing where the next one was located. The air in the street suddenly felt colder, as if the sun had been permanently blotted out by the smoke. Stephen stepped out onto the sidewalk and realized that the warnings being telephoned into the newsrooms were actually creating a more dangerous situation. He watched as a group of people were directed away from a car bomb on one street, only to be moved directly into the blast radius of a second device hidden in a trash can on the corner. The logic of the city had completely collapsed. The warnings weren't meant to save lives. They were meant to ensure that the police were stretched so thin that they couldn't possibly clear every area in time for the next explosion. Your heart isn't just beating fast now. It is slamming against your ribs like a hammer against a steel plate. You are standing in the middle of a crowded intersection, and you can hear the sirens and the shouting from every direction. You look to your left and see a plume of black smoke rising from the bus station where you were supposed to be standing 10 minutes ago. You look to your right and see a line of soldiers shouting at people to move back, but there is nowhere to go. The air is thick with the smell of burning rubber and the metallic tang of blood on the hot pavement. You can feel the vibration of another explosion deep in your chest, a low-frequency rumble that makes the windows of the nearby buildings rattle in their frames. You want to run, but your legs feel like they are made of lead. You look at the faces of the people around you and see the same raw, primal fear reflected in their eyes. The normalcy of your life has been stripped away in the span of an hour, leaving you exposed and vulnerable in a city that has turned into a minefield. You realize that every step you take could be your last, and there is no one who can help you. You look down at your hands and see that they are covered in the same gray dust that was on the police officer. You try to wipe it off, but it just smears against your skin, a reminder of the destruction that is happening all around you. The sound of the city has been replaced by a cacophony of wailing, glass breaking, and the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of army helicopters circling overhead. You feel a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline as you realize that you need to get home to your son. You need to know that Liam is safe, but the path to your house is blocked by fire and debris. You are Stephen. You are standing on that corner, and the police are telling you to run toward the market. But you just saw a suspicious van parked near the entrance of that very market. Do you trust the authorities who are clearly overwhelmed and guessing? Or do you trust your own instincts and run in the opposite direction toward the docks? Because here is the thing. The IRA had calculated the human reaction to the chaos. They knew that people would cluster together for safety, and they placed the bombs in the very places where those crowds would naturally form. One wrong turn could lead you into the fire. The bizarre reveal of Bloody Friday was that the Provisional IRA had sent as many as 30 separate warnings for 22 different bombs within a 70-minute window. They claimed they wanted to minimize civilian casualties, but they knew the sheer volume of information would paralyze the emergency services. By flooding the lines with conflicting reports, they ensured that the police would be moving people from one blast zone directly into another. It was a tactical use of psychological terror designed not just to destroy property, but to prove that the British government could not protect its citizens. The aftermath of those 80 minutes was a city that looked like a war zone. 9 people were killed instantly, including 2 soldiers and several teenagers. Over 130 people were left with horrific, life-altering injuries, many of them losing limbs to the flying glass and shrapnel. The images of firemen shoveling human remains into plastic bags in the middle of a shopping street horrified the world. It was a day that marked a permanent escalation in the conflict, leading the British Army to launch Operation Motorman, the largest military operation in Ireland since the 1920s. Stephen survived that day by a matter of yards, having chosen to ignore the police and hide in a concrete basement until the sirens finally stopped. He walked home through a city that he no longer recognized, the streets littered with the charred remains of cars and the shredded pieces of shop awnings. He found his wife and son huddled in their living room, the windows taped over to prevent them from shattering. He held Liam so tight that the boy started to cry, the hardware store clerk realizing that the normalcy he had anchored his life in was a fragile illusion that could be shattered in 80 minutes. The violence of Belfast in 1972 was a story of a city being torn apart by a visible, explosive force. It was a war of bombs and soldiers, where the enemy was often a neighbor or a face in the crowd. But while the fires were burning in Northern Ireland, a different kind of shadow was being cast over the Middle East. This one didn't involve bombs in marketplaces, but it did involve the secrets of the past being brought into the light of the present. The archives of the 1940s were being opened, revealing a mystery about a legendary singer whose death might have been a calculated move in a different war. The transition from the blood-stained streets of Belfast to the dusty archives of Beirut is a journey from the chaos of the present to the ghost of the past. In Ireland, the truth was written in fire and glass. In Lebanon, the truth was hidden in old, yellowed documents that suggested an accident from 1944 was actually a professional hit. Both stories involved the use of death as a political tool, whether through a 20-pound bomb or a calculated car crash into a canal. In 1972, a journalist was about to realize that some voices are so powerful that they have to be silenced twice. In 1972, a journalist in Beirut uncovered a set of leaked intelligence documents that reignited a decades-old mystery. The papers concerned the 1944 death of a legendary singer named Asmahan, whose car had mysteriously veered into a canal. For years, it was called a tragic accident. But instead of a simple mechanical failure, the new evidence suggested a high-level assassination orchestrated by British intelligence. The mystery is not just who killed the star, but why the truth was being weaponized as propaganda in the middle of a 1970s intelligence war. The air inside the small, cramped archive room in Beirut during the summer of 1972 was thick and almost impossible to breathe. It had a heavy, cloying scent of old, yellowing paper that had been sitting in the damp for nearly 30 years. If you were sitting there, the only sound you would hear was the rhythmic, metallic click-click-click of a rusted ceiling fan that was doing more to stir the dust than to cool the room. Underneath that sound, there was the faint, muffled roar of the city outside, but in here, time seemed to have stopped. The dust motes danced in the single sliver of sunlight that managed to cut through the grime on the high, narrow window. Every time you moved a file, a fresh cloud of white powder would rise up, stinging your nostrils and making your eyes water. There was a specific, gritty texture to the paper, a dryness that felt like it would crumble if you turned the pages too fast. It was a sterile, lonely atmosphere, where the ghosts of the past seemed to be huddled in the corners, waiting for someone to finally read the secrets they had been guarding since the war. Amal al-Atrash, known to the world as Asmahan, was 26 years old when she died, and she was arguably the most famous woman in the Middle East. She was a Druze princess, with eyes the color of the Mediterranean, and a voice that was said to be a gift from the heavens. But Asmahan wasn't just a singer. She was a woman who lived a life of extreme danger, moving between the palaces of kings and the secret offices of foreign spies. She was a mother, a diva, and a double agent who believed she was clever enough to play the British, the French, and the Nazis against each other. To the public, Asmahan was a symbol of glamour and tragic beauty. She lived in luxury hotels, wore the finest silks, and her face was plastered on every cinema screen from Cairo to Baghdad. People loved her for her music, but they whispered about her lifestyle. She was a woman who smoked, drank, and socialized with powerful men, breaking every social rule of her time. But behind the scenes, she was a person who was deeply lonely, anchored by a sense of duty to her people, but trapped by the very intelligence agencies that funded her extravagant lifestyle. The routine for a journalist like Samir in 1972 involved a slow, agonizingly mundane stretch of research. He spent his days in these dusty rooms, his fingers perpetually stained with black ink and gray dust. He would sit for hours with a magnifying glass, cross-referencing names on old payrolls and flight manifests from the 1940s. He would take small sips of bitter, lukewarm coffee, the liquid leaving a dark ring on his notepad. He found a strange kind of comfort in the repetitive nature of the work, the way the numbers and dates eventually began to form a pattern. He would spend his afternoons walking through the narrow, crowded streets of the Hamra district, his mind still filled with the details of a woman who had been dead for nearly 30 years. He would watch the people in the cafes, the smell of apple tobacco and roasting lamb filling the air, and he would wonder how many of them remembered the way Asmahan's voice used to fill those same streets. He was anchored in the history of his city, believing that if he could just find the right document, he could finally balance the ledger of a life that had been cut short. Every night, he followed the same ritual. He would return to his apartment, lock the 3 separate deadbolts on his door, and spread his notes out on the kitchen table. He would listen to the sound of his neighbor's radio and the distant sirens of a city that was slowly sliding toward civil war. He would smoke one cigarette, the blue smoke curling toward the ceiling, and he would read the testimony of the driver who had survived the crash that killed Asmahan. He was looking for a detail that everyone else had missed, a tiny inconsistency that would prove the accident was a lie. The subtle shift happened when Samir came across a specific expense report from a defunct branch of British military intelligence. The document was a list of payments made in July of 1944, the same month Asmahan's car veered into that canal in Mansoura. One entry caught his eye, a large sum of money paid to a local mechanic for unspecified services related to vehicle maintenance. The name of the mechanic was familiar. Samir had seen that same name on a modern list of government consultants in 1972. It was a detail that was logically out of place. He sat back in his chair, the paper feeling suddenly heavy in his hand. He looked at the date on the report and then at the name of the mechanic. The logic was chilling. If this man had been paid by the British to maintain a vehicle right before it crashed, and he was still being paid by powerful interests today, it meant the conspiracy wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a living, breathing secret. The air in the archive room suddenly felt much colder, and Samir realized that he wasn't just looking at a ghost. He was looking at a murder that was still being protected. Your heart isn't just beating fast now. It is slamming against your ribs like a hammer. You are walking through the dark streets of Beirut, and every shadow looks like a man in a trench coat. You can feel the weight of the photocopied documents in your jacket pocket, pressing against your chest like a lead plate. The smell of the city, the jasmine, and the trash feels overwhelming, and you find it hard to draw a full breath. You turn a corner and see a black car idling with its lights off. Your muscles go completely rigid, and you can taste the metallic tang of fear in your mouth. You keep your head down, your leather shoes making a sharp, frantic clicking sound on the pavement. You want to run, but you know that would only draw attention. You think about the face of Asmahan, her beautiful, tragic eyes staring out from an old photograph, and you realize that you have stepped into the same web that killed her. The silence of the night is no longer peaceful. It is a pressurized void where every sound is a potential threat. You reach the door of your apartment building, your hands trembling so much that you can barely fit the key into the lock. You are Samir. You are sitting in your dark kitchen, the documents spread out before you like a death warrant. You have the proof that one of the world's most beloved singers was executed by a foreign government to keep her from talking. You know that if you publish this, you will trigger a political firestorm that could destroy the careers of men who are still very much in power. Do you give the story to your editor and hope for the best, or do you burn the papers in the sink and pretend you never found them? Because once the truth is out, there is no going back to your quiet life. The bizarre reveal of the archival leak was that Asmahan's death wasn't just a simple hit. British intelligence had discovered that she was planning to defect to the French or the Nazis with information about the post-war borders of the Middle East. They couldn't afford to let her talk, but they also couldn't afford to make her a martyr. So, they hired a mechanic to subtly sabotage the steering column of her car. When the vehicle hit a sharp turn near the canal, the steering snapped, sending her into the water, while the driver, who had been paid to jump out at the last second, survived to tell the lie. The revelation in 1972 was being used by rival intelligence agencies to stir up anti-British sentiment in Lebanon and Egypt. The ghost of Asmahan was being summoned to fight a new battle in a different war. Samir's story was published, but within 48 hours, the archives he had used were accidentally destroyed in a fire, and the mechanic he had identified disappeared without a trace. The truth had been brought into the light for just a few days before the shadows reclaimed it, leaving the world with nothing but the haunting sound of Asmahan's voice on a scratched record. Samir lived the rest of his life in a state of quiet paranoia, always looking over his shoulder and never quite trusting the silence of a room. He had learned that some secrets are so powerful that they can reach across decades to silence anyone who dares to speak them. Asmahan remained a legend, her death a mystery that would never be officially solved, a symbol of a world where beauty and talent are often the first casualties of war. Her story was a reminder that the mind can be a dangerous place when it holds too many secrets, and sometimes those secrets can drive a person to the brink of madness. The mystery of Asmahan was a story of a woman whose life was a complicated dance between power and betrayal. It was a psychological struggle against an invisible enemy that used the past to manipulate the present. But while Samir was uncovering the secrets of an old assassination in the humidity of Beirut, another kind of psychological nightmare was unfolding in the mountains of Japan. This one didn't involve international spies or legendary singers, but a group of young people who had become so trapped in their own ideology that they began to devour themselves from the inside out. The transition from the dusty archives of Lebanon to the freezing, blood-stained cabin on Mount Haruna is a journey from the secrets of the state to the madness of the mind. In Beirut, the threat was a calculated hit by a foreign government. In Japan, the threat was the person sitting right next to you, a friend who had been turned into a judge and an executioner by the twisted logic of a cult. Both stories involved the total erasure of the individual in the service of a higher power. In 1972, the world was about to see that a group of students could become more terrifying than any secret agent. In early 1972, a group of young, idealistic revolutionaries retreated to a remote cabin on Mount Haruna in Japan to build a better world. They were exactly where they wanted to be, preparing for a glorious uprising. But instead of fighting the government, the group's leaders would turn on their own members, conducting a trial that involved brutal beatings and exposure to the freezing winter air. The mystery is not just the madness of the purge, but why 12 young people allowed themselves to be executed by their friends without ever trying to run away. The wind on Mount Haruna in January doesn't just blow. It screams through the gaps in the wooden siding of the cabin like a dying animal. If you were standing inside that structure in 1972, the first thing you would notice was the smell of wood smoke mixed with the heavy, unwashed scent of 20 people packed into a single room. Underneath the wind, there was a rhythmic, wet sound that didn't belong in a peaceful mountain retreat. It was the sound of a fist hitting skin over and over again, a steady and mechanical thumping that seemed to pulse in time with the flickering of the kerosene lamps. The air was so cold that every breath came out as a thick white cloud, but the heat inside the room was oppressive from the sheer number of bodies. There was the constant, low-frequency sound of shivering, a collective vibration of teeth chattering that never seemed to stop. You would smell the metallic tang of blood and the sharp, chemical odor of fear that permeates a space when everyone knows the exit is blocked by more than just snow. The silence between the blows was the worst part, a suffocating void where the only thing you could hear was the frantic beating of your own heart. Kenji was 22 years old and a senior at a top university in Tokyo. He was the kind of young man who spent his weekends volunteering at local shelters and his nights reading philosophy by candlelight. He had a younger sister who looked up to him and parents who expected him to become a successful lawyer. Kenji wasn't a violent person. He was a dreamer who believed that the world was fundamentally broken and that his generation was the only one with the courage to fix it. He joined the United Red Army because he wanted to be part of something larger than himself, something that felt real. His life before the mountains was a series of predictable, safe rituals. Every morning, he would drink tea with his mother in their small garden, watching the birds landing on the stone lantern. He loved the specific sound of the pages turning in his heavy textbooks and the smell of the old libraries where he spent most of his time. He was a man who valued logic and compassion, and he believed that the revolution was a path toward a more just society. He was anchored in the normalcy of a bright future, never imagining that his idealism would lead him to a freezing cabin in the middle of nowhere. The first few weeks on Mount Haruna followed a repetitive and almost hypnotic routine. Every morning at 6 o'clock, the members would wake up and perform a series of calisthenics in the snow. The sound of their boots crunching on the frozen ground was the first sign of the day. They would then retreat inside for a breakfast of plain rice and miso soup, eating in silence to maintain their discipline. Kenji spent his mornings hauling heavy logs for the fire, the physical exertion providing a welcome distraction from the biting cold. He found a sense of purpose in the simple labor. After the physical work was done, the group would gather for ideological study sessions. They would sit in a circle on the floor, passing around dog-eared manifestos and discussing the nuances of their mission. These sessions were long and exhausting, lasting for hours as they analyzed their own thoughts and actions. Kenji would listen to the leaders, Tsuneo Mori and Hiroko Nagata, as they spoke about the need for total devotion. He would nod along, feeling a sense of pride in his commitment. The mundane nature of the study made the radical ideas feel like simple, everyday facts of life. In the afternoons, the members were assigned to cleaning and maintenance tasks. Kenji would scrub the wooden floors with a damp rag, moving in long, rhythmic strokes that left the wood gleaming in the dim light. He would listen to the wind whistling outside and the muffled chatter of the other members as they worked. There was a sense of camaraderie in the shared struggle, a feeling that they were all cogs in a magnificent machine. He believed that this period of isolation was a necessary trial, a way to forge their spirits into something unbreakable. He felt completely at home. The evenings were spent in more discussion, often lasting late into the night. They would take turns sharing their personal histories, looking for signs of bourgeois weakness that needed to be purged. It was a repetitive, almost ritualistic process of self-criticism. Kenji would talk about his upbringing and his education, trying to find ways to prove he was worthy of the cause. He felt a deep sense of security in the rules and the structure provided by the leaders. He believed that as long as he followed the script, he would be safe. He was resting in the mundane, unaware. The subtle shift happened during a session in late January. One of the members, a young woman who had been a close friend of Kenji, was singled out for not being sufficiently enthusiastic during the morning exercises. Usually, this would result in a verbal reprimand, a logical part of their self-criticism ritual. But this time, Mori didn't stop at words. He told the group that she needed to be physically corrected to help her spirit wake up. He ordered 2 other members to strike her. It was a detail that was logically out of place. This wasn't a debate, it was a physical assault. Kenji watched in a state of frozen confusion as his friends began to hit the young woman. He expected someone to stop it, to point out that this wasn't what they were about. But the air in the room had changed. The logic of the group had shifted from persuasion to force. The silence that followed the first blow was heavy and absolute. No one spoke up. No one moved to help. The realization that the rules had changed hit Kenji with a cold, physical pressure. This wasn't a revolution anymore. It was a cage. The mundane routine of the cabin had been replaced by a nightmare of betrayal. Your heart isn't just beating fast now. It is slamming against your ribs like a hammer against a steel plate. You are sitting in that circle, watching your friend being beaten, and you realize that you are next. The air in the cabin feels thick and suffocating, like you are trying to breathe through a wet cloth. You can feel the sweat trickling down your spine despite the freezing cold. You look at the faces of your comrades, and you don't see friends anymore. You see executioners who are waiting for a signal. You want to scream, but your throat is so dry that it hurts to swallow. You can hear the wet, heavy sound of the blows and the muffled moans of the person on the floor. Every time a fist makes contact, you feel it in your own body, a sympathetic jolt of pain that makes your stomach turn. You look at Mori and Nagata, and their eyes are flat and empty, as if they are watching a scientific experiment rather than the destruction of a human being. The logic of the world has completely collapsed. You are trapped in a wooden box on a mountain, and the only thing more dangerous than the cold outside is the people sitting right next to you in the dark. You are Kenji. You have a choice to make. Do you stand up and try to stop the violence, knowing that the entire group will turn on you instantly? Or do you keep your head down and hope that by participating in the trial, you can prove your loyalty and stay alive for one more night? Because here is the thing. Once you raise your hand against a friend, you are no longer the person you used to be. You are part of the machine. The people who were murdered on Mount Haruna weren't just victims of the leaders. They were victims of their own friends who were too afraid to say no. The bizarre reveal of the United Red Army purge was the scale of the self-destruction. Over the course of a few weeks, 12 members, nearly half of the entire group, were murdered by their own comrades. They were beaten, tied up in the snow, or left to starve until they died. The madness only ended when the survivors fled the cabin and took over a ski lodge in the Osama Sanzo incident, leading to a 10-day televised standoff with the police. When the authorities finally entered the mountain retreat, they found the shallow graves of the purged members, their bodies a silent testament to the horror. The aftermath of the purge destroyed any public sympathy for radical movements in Japan. The images of the bodies being unearthed in the snow horrified a nation that had once viewed these students as idealistic heroes. Mori and Nagata were captured and eventually sentenced to death, though Mori would take his own life in his prison cell before the sentence could be carried out. The story of Mount Haruna remains a haunting reminder of how easily the human mind can be twisted by a cult of personality, and how the pursuit of a perfect world can lead to a literal, freezing hell on Earth. Kenji was one of the members who didn't survive the mountain. His name was added to the list of the purged, his dreams of justice and philosophy buried under 3 feet of frozen Japanese soil. He had walked into that cabin looking for a better world, and found only the cold, mechanical cruelty of his own peers. His story is a testament to the fragility of the individual when faced with the crushing weight of a group. It was a tragedy written in blood and snow, a silent chemical fear that would linger in the Japanese psyche for decades, much like the fear used to silence others. The Violence in the Mountains of Japan was a story of a group of people turning on themselves with primitive, physical brutality. It was a war fought with fists and cold, where the weapons were as simple as the human hand. But while the graves were being dug in the snow of Mount Haruna, thousands of miles away in a quiet apartment in Paris, a much more sophisticated kind of violence was being prepared. This one didn't involve beatings or exposure to the elements. It involved the cold, technical precision of an identical piece of furniture and a bomb hidden in a marble-topped telephone table. The transition from the blood-stained wood of the mountain cabin to the elegant marble of a Parisian apartment is a journey from the chaos of a cult to the surgical precision of an international hit. In Japan, the weapon was the collective fist of a group. In France, the weapon was a technical masterpiece, a telephone table that looked exactly like the one it replaced, but carried a lethal secret. Both stories involved the use of a mundane, everyday object to deliver a message of death. In 1972, the world was about to see that even a phone call could be turned into a professional execution. The air in a quiet Parisian apartment during the early winter of 1972 didn't feel like a place of war. It had a very specific, peaceful scent of strong, dark roast coffee mixing with the faint, sweet aroma of old books and French perfume. If you were standing in the hallway, the only sound you would hear was the distant, muffled hum of traffic on the Rue des Liches and the rhythmic, high-pitched chirping of a small bird in a cage near the window. It was a sterile, comforting atmosphere where the only thing that mattered was the next meal or the next conversation with a friend. Underneath that domestic peace, if you were listening very closely, you might have heard a faint, electronic buzz coming from the wall. It was the sound of a telephone line carrying a signal, a tiny, vibrating hum that was almost imperceptible to the human ear. There was also the cold, clinical scent of a marble tabletop that had been polished so thoroughly it felt like ice under your fingertips. The silence in the room was a pressurized void, waiting for a single, mechanical event to shatter it. The air was heavy with the weight of a secret that was hidden in plain sight. Mahmoud Hamshari was 34 years old, and he was a man who lived a life of extreme intellectual intensity. He was the official representative of the Palestine Liberation Organization in France, a role that required him to be part diplomat, part scholar, and part shadow. Mahmoud was known for his sharp mind and his ability to navigate the complex world of European politics with a calm, understated grace. He was a man who loved his wife, Marie-Claude, and their young daughter, Amina, and he spent his few free hours reading history books and drinking tea in the sun. To the outside world, Mahmoud was a high-ranking official, a man with a public face and a clear mission. But in the world of international intelligence, he was a marked man. Following the tragedy at the Munich Olympics, the Israeli government had authorized a secret campaign called Operation Wrath of God, aimed at eliminating those they believed were responsible for the attack. Mahmoud was on their list. He knew the risks of his position, but he believed that the city of Paris provided a certain level of protection, a boundary that his enemies would not dare to cross. His life was anchored in a series of predictable and comforting rituals that balanced the stress of his work. Every morning at precisely 7 o'clock, he would wake up and spend 30 minutes listening to the news on the radio while he dressed in a sharp, conservative suit. He found a sense of order in the way he would adjust his tie and make sure his cufflinks were perfectly aligned. He was a man who valued the small details of his appearance, believing that a professional exterior was his first line of defense against the chaos of the world he inhabited. The mundane stretch of his daily routine was a masterclass in calculated repetition. After he finished his coffee, he would walk to his study and begin the process of reviewing the daily correspondence from Beirut and Cairo. He would sit at his desk for hours, the only sound being the scratch of his fountain pen on expensive parchment. He would organize the documents by priority, placing the most urgent files in a leather folder that he kept within arm's reach. He found a strange kind of peace in the physical handling of the paper, the weight and texture of it being a constant. In the middle of the afternoon, he would perform his most important ritual, checking the telephone. In 1972, the phone wasn't just a communication tool, it was the lifeline of his entire operation. He would pick up the heavy, black receiver and listen for a dial tone, making sure the line was clear of any interference. He would run his hand over the smooth, cool surface of the marble-top table that held the phone, checking for any signs of dust or scratches. It was a repetitive, almost obsessive habit that served as a way to ground himself in his environment. He spent a long time looking out the window at the streets below, watching the way the Parisian light changed from a bright gold to a soft, hazy gray. He would listen to the muffled sounds of the neighbors in the hallway and the distant sirens that never seemed to stop. He felt a deep sense of security in the predictable nature of his surroundings. He believed that as long as he maintained his routine and kept his eyes open, he could manage the threats that lived in the shadows. He was resting in the mundane, unaware that the shadow was already inside his living room. For weeks, the apartment had been a sanctuary of habit and focus. He would spend his evenings eating dinner with his family, the sound of their laughter being the highlight of his day. He would help Amina with her homework, his large hands guiding her pencil across the page with a gentle, patient touch. He was a man who understood the value of domestic harmony, and he used these moments to recharge his mental energy for the battles he fought in the press and the diplomatic corridors. He believed that the walls of his home were a fortress that could keep the world at bay. The routine extended to the way he handled his visitors. He was a man of hospitality, and he would often host journalists and scholars for long discussions over tea. He enjoyed the intellectual sparring and the opportunity to explain his cause to anyone who would listen. He would sit in his favorite armchair, the one with the worn velvet cushions, and speak in a low, measured voice that commanded attention. He was an anchor of normalcy in a city that was increasingly becoming a battlefield for the world's intelligence agencies, a man who refused to be intimidated by the unseen. He would spend his late nights back in the study, the light from a single lamp casting long shadows across the walls. He would perform a final check of the locks on the doors and the windows, his movements slow and deliberate. He would then sit back down at the marble-top table and make a series of short, coded phone calls to his contacts across Europe. The sound of the rotary dial spinning back into place was the final, reassuring note of his day. He felt a sense of control in the mechanical nature of these tasks, believing that he was always one step ahead of the threat. The subtle shift happened during a week in late November, when Mahmoud received a request for an interview from a team of Italian journalists. They seemed professional and well-informed, and they were eager to hear his perspective on the recent events in the Middle East. Mahmoud agreed to meet them, and over the course of several days, they visited his apartment multiple times. They spent a long time in his study, asking questions and taking notes. It was a logical part of his work, but there was a detail that was logically out of place. They seemed very interested in his furniture. One of the journalists, a man with a soft voice and steady hands, spent several minutes admiring the marble-top telephone table. He asked Mahmoud about its history and even took a few measurements, claiming he wanted to find a similar piece for his own home in Rome. Mahmoud didn't think much of it at the time. He took it as a compliment to his taste. But as the days went by, he noticed that the table felt a little different. It was cleaner than usual, the marble having a high-gloss sheen that he didn't remember. It was a tiny, subtle change in the atmosphere of his study. The logic in his brain started to misfire on the morning of December 8th. He woke up to a phone call from one of the journalists, who said he was calling from a nearby booth to confirm a meeting later that day. Mahmoud picked up the receiver and felt a strange, cold vibration coming through the marble of the tabletop. It wasn't the usual hum of the phone line. It was a deeper, more mechanical resonance. He glanced down at the table and noticed that the marble was a slightly different shade of white than it had been a week ago, but he dismissed it as a trick of the winter light. Your heart isn't just beating fast now. It is slamming against your ribs like a hammer against a steel plate. You are sitting at your desk, and the phone is ringing again. It is the same journalist, and he is asking you to confirm your identity. You reach out and place your hand on the heavy marble tabletop to steady yourself, and you can feel the cold radiating through your palm and up your arm. The air in the study feels thick and suffocating, and the chirping of the bird in the hallway suddenly sounds like a warning you can't understand. You pull the receiver to your ear. You say your name into the mouthpiece, your voice sounding strange and distant to your own ears. In that exact second, you hear a faint, metallic click coming from inside the base of the table, directly beneath your hand. It is a sound that shouldn't exist in a piece of furniture. You feel a sudden, sharp pressure in the center of your chest, and the light in the room begins to flicker with a terrifying, white intensity. You want to drop the phone and run, but your muscles are frozen in a moment of absolute, bone-chilling realization. You have invited the monster into your home. You are Mahmoud Hamshari. You are sitting in that apartment, and the phone is still at your ear. You can feel the vibration of a radio signal being received just inches away from your stomach. Do you drop the receiver and dive for the floor, knowing you only have a fraction of a second to move? Or do you freeze in a state of total, paralyzed shock, wondering how a simple telephone table could become a weapon of war? Because here is the thing. The people on the other end of the line weren't journalists. They were operators who were waiting for you to say the one word that would end your life. The bizarre reveal of the Hamshari assassination was the technical genius of the hit. Mossad agents, posing as the Italian journalists, had gained access to Mahmoud's apartment and used the opportunity to take exact measurements and photographs of his telephone table. They then went back to a safe house and constructed a perfect, identical replica out of wood and marble. But inside the base of this new table, they hidden a high explosive charge and a radio-detonated trigger. During a later visit, while Mahmoud was distracted, they simply swapped the real table for the bomb, leaving him with a lethal secret in his study. When Mahmoud confirmed his identity on that final phone call, an agent sitting in a van down the street pressed a button. The explosion was contained and surgical, designed to kill the person sitting at the desk without destroying the entire building. The marble top disintegrated into thousands of lethal shards, and the blast itself tore through Mahmoud's midsection. He survived the initial explosion, but the damage was too great. He spent the next several weeks in a hospital bed, slowly fading away as the world watched the fallout of the first remote detonated technical hit in the War of the Shadows. Mahmoud Hamshari died in January of 1973, but the legacy of his death changed the rules of international espionage forever. It proved that the most mundane objects in a person's life could be turned into instruments of death with enough planning and technical skill. It was the beginning of an era of high-tech assassinations that would redefine how intelligence agencies operated in foreign cities. The apartment on the Rue de l'Essia was no longer a sanctuary. It was a museum of a new kind of fear, a reminder that the boundary between the safe and the dangerous is often just a thin layer of marble. The story of the telephone table is the final chapter in our journey through the strange, the dark, and the mysterious of the 1970s. We have traveled from the moonlit vineyards of Italy to the freezing mountains of Japan, from the halls of power in Washington to the remote glaciers of the Andes. We have seen how a single piece of tape, a bamboo stick, or a cup of coffee can become a pivot point for history. Each of these stories is a testament to the fragility of normalcy and the incredible, terrifying things that can happen when the rules of the world are suddenly and violently rewritten. The 14 people we have talked about were all anchors in their own lives, individuals who believed they were safe in their routines and their homes. But they all found themselves caught in the gears of a much larger and darker machine. Whether it was a serial killer in Florence, a mob hit in New York, or a state-sponsored massacre in Mexico, they were all victims of a world that was losing its grip on the definition of safety. Their stories remain with us, not just as tragedies, but as warnings about the shadows that live in the gaps between the moments of our everyday existence. As we close the files on 1971 and 72, we are left with the realization that the strange and the dark are not just things that happen to other people in distant lands. They are part of the fabric of our world, hidden in the mundane details of a train station, a family photo, or a telephone call. The mystery of why these events happen and why people choose the paths they do is a question that may never have a final answer. But by telling their stories, we keep their memories alive and remind ourselves to always keep looking over our shoulder, just in case the shadow is closer than we think.